Welcome to the budget meeting for fiscal 2015. Appreciate everybody coming out this morning. It's terrific. This is obviously a very important exercise the village goes through every year. It is a point on a timeline of work that is done throughout the year to get to this juncture. So a lot of the budget document, and if you don't already have a copy, there are copies behind you on the table. Mary's holding up a copy right now. Very Vanna White-like, thank you. A lot of what's in the document is driven by the strategic planning process that took place earlier in the year. So when we get to this point, a lot of the things that are in the budget have been discussed to some degree already. This is where it actually turns into a budget document and we start talking about it. This is the first of a series of public meetings that we'll be holding on the budget process, and the final adoption is not until, well, there's the schedule up on the screen there. We get into the final approval process towards the end of the year, so this is the first of many opportunities for public input and discussion. There won't be any actions taken taken today with respect to the budget. This is just a process where we're continuing to discuss it amongst the council, and there will be opportunities for public comment. What I'm going to suggest is you see that there's a timeline over on the board. That is approximately what we're going to try to hit today in terms of timing. And we will periodically stop maybe after every segment and take any comments from any folks in the audience. One thing I'd like to do is that, this is something, it's a big deal. Over $100 million budget, both operating and capital, is a big deal. We're glad that people come out. I'm going to suggest that the people who are in this room that are involved with the process of putting together this document introduce themselves, because I think residents, it's nice to know who's who in the village. I'll start with myself and then ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. And then I'm going to put our staff on the spot too and have them introduce themselves so that you know the different roles of the people who are in the village that do the things day to day that actually make Downers Grove the great place it is. So good morning. My name is Martin Tully. I'm the mayor of the village of Downers Grove. I appreciate that you're here. And I'll turn it over for my colleagues to introduce themselves and we'll go around the room.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Neustadt. Thanks for coming today.
Good morning. Greg Jose. Thanks for coming out.
I'm Bob Barnett. Good morning, everybody.
David Olson.
Becky Rankin.
I'm Dave Fieldman, village manager.
I'm Mike Baker. I'm the deputy village manager.
April Holden, village clerk.
Judy Butney, finance director. Nan Newland, public works director.
Alex Policano, building division manager.
Stan Popovich, penny manager. Andy Stickich, assistant director of public works for engineering.
Stan Malicki, assistant director of public works for operations.
Don Esberg, director of human resources.
Morning, Bob Porter, chief of police.
Kurt Blue, deputy police chief.
Allison Knight, performance manager.
Jim Jackson, your fire chief.
Leon Wood, director of business technology.
Matt Daly, deputy fire chief.
Mary Pratt, emergency management coordinator.
Hans Pachwarka, village attorney.
Doug Kozlowski, communications director. Good morning.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I think all of them hope that that's the last time they have to speak this morning. Thank you for doing that. What we'll do then is, what we normally do is turn things over to our village manager, David Fieldman, who introduced himself a moment ago, to introduce the different segments of today's discussion. So, good morning and welcome again.
Well, Mayor Tully has done a great job with the welcome and overview, so we're going to jump right into the presentation of the tax levy and the actual funds, and you can follow along in your book. I just want to start with a quick overview. There's really 5 things we want you to know about this budget as proposed. First is that property taxes are proposed to decrease. Property tax levy is proposed to decrease. That's because the amount the village has to levy for police and fire pensions is going down. Both of those funds had a great year in their investment returns. So the first key point, property taxes proposed to go down. Second key point, the general fund, which is our main operating fund, is balanced and sustainable with revenues equal to expenses. So we operate on a balanced budget and have for years. Third key point, the amount of employees at the village, or staffing, headcount, is also proposed to go down by about 3.5 full-time equivalent positions. Our staffing has been reduced significantly since the beginning of the Great Recession, about 15%. That trend continues with this budget. Fourth key point, continued investment in infrastructure. The village has focused on reinvesting and investing in our infrastructure systems like streets, stormwater, and sidewalk. This budget allows us to keep moving forward on those investment plans. In the second section of today's budget meeting, you'll hear about some of the details of the proposed fee increases in stormwater utility and the fee increases in the water rates that allow us to continue those investments. And finally, the fifth key point, this budget does provide funding for all of the priority action items that the council has identified we should be working on for the balance of this year and into next year. One of the key priority action items is facilities. You will hear about that in the third portion of our meeting. So those are the 5 key points. I also want to explain what this budget, how this proposed budget would impact a typical house in Downers Grove. And this budget impact financially to the typical house in Downers Grove is about $72.40 increase in the year, $72.40 over the whole year. That's a combination of property tax going down about $9 a year in a typical house, stormwater fee going up just over $9 a year for a typical house, and the water rates going up over $70, about $72 for the typical user. So that is the financial impact on a typical house of the budget that you will hear about today. With that as an overview, I wanted to jump right into the presentation of funds. So we're right here at property tax levy, which can be found on pages 1-3 and 1-4 of the budget book. Starting off, there's, I think, sometimes some confusion about property taxes. The Village of Downers Grove levies an amount, a specific dollar amount. We do not set a tax rate. The village levies a total amount, and the township assessor determines the value of each property in the village and therefore determines how much of that levy your property will pay. So the rate is really just a function of how much the village levies compared to how much the township assessor says all the properties in Downers Grove are worth. I think this concept will make more sense when I put this slide up on the board, and I'll call your attention to the lowest line in yellow here. And what it shows is our total tax levy proposed. In the left-hand side, FY14, we levied about $11.6 million. And for FY15, the proposal is to levy just over $11.4 million, which is a decrease of about $180,000, decrease of about 1.5%. I highlighted the 2 portions of our levy that are going down. That is the fire pension levy and the police pension levy. Again, the village makes the required contributions to these funds every year, but because they have performed so well, our required contribution for FY15 is actually slightly lower than FY14. All other components of the village tax levy remain flat or unchanged. Let me show you how this levy would affect a typical house in Downers Grove. A typical house in Downers Grove has a market value of about $300,000, which means it has a taxable value of about $100,000. With what we levied last year, that house did pay $574 to the Village of Downers Grove. This same house next year would pay about $565 to the Village of Downers Grove. That reflects the levy decrease we talked about. That's about a $9 a year savings or reduction in the property tax. Now, many of you are probably thinking, wait a minute, I pay a lot more than $575 in taxes. That's correct, you do. And the reason for that is there are many, many taxing bodies on your tax bill, and the Village of Downers Grove is just one of them. In fact, in this dollar bill graphic here, you can see the split of the major taxing bodies on your tax bill, and you'll see that the village, based on last year's numbers, was 9% of your total tax bill for property taxes. It's the 2 school districts that make up the majority of the tax bill. That is their primary revenue source. Then you see the other taxing bodies here on the dollar bill as well. And with that, I'd like to stop and pause, Mayor, and offer any questions, comments, concerns about the property tax levy.
Thank you. Obviously, the property tax levy going down is good news and the function of the different factors that you mentioned. So that's terrific, and this is a trend that we've continued over the last few years of either keeping the property tax levy flat or reducing it. The one thing that we can't control is, of course, the required funding for public safety pensions. That's a product of direction from mandates in Springfield and also the performance of those pension funds. Unfortunately, this year, I don't know if it's good to say that the investments performed well. They performed better than they have in the last number of years.
They actually returned 14% in the market,
I'll call that well,
which is double the estimated return in their model, so they really nailed it.
That is well, but it's also substantially better than what it has been over the last few years, so that's good news and results in this. And I know you're going to come back to water when we talk about that at 9 o'clock or thereabouts, and explaining why there's that big increase in water and why that too is something that comes from beyond our borders.
Yeah, the quick preview of that is it's driven by the cost of water that we buy water from the DuPage Water Commission, and I think Nan Newland, our Public Works Director, will hit that later today.
Right. So any questions from the council with respect to what's been presented so far?
Mayor, am I accurate though on it? If we use it, go back to that typical.
Use the mic, Bob.
Sorry, Laurel. This is a challenge for me. You guys that are here for the first time listen to me, I have a hard time with speaking up. I apologize. On a 574 typical bill though, if we look at this slide and we look at the likely impact on the individual household in net dollars, we're looking at about a 12.5% increase, right? 72 was the increase to a typical household.
Oh, all components of the budget.
A typical household bill of $575 or so will see a approximately $72 increase in their cost of the village's services, correct?
That's correct. I don't know what the percent increase is because the base would be on what's your typical water bill, what's your typical stormwater fee, and then, but yes, this is one component.
That's what we're talking about.
That's correct.
Actually, could you go back to that slide now that you brought it up? The water slide.
The slide right here.
Basically, between the decrease in the property tax and the increase in the stormwater fee, if you just took those numbers on the screen, it's almost a net zero impact. The whole driver here is the increase in the water fees, which is the increase in the cost of water, which we have to buy from outside sources.
Correct.
So if it wasn't for the increase in water, based on what we can control, it would almost be a net zero impact. So the real driver is clearly the water, which I know we'll be talking about later.
When we get into the water, you're going to go through a little bit about our source for everybody.
Yes, sir.
I think it's worth repeating a few times.
His name was Ron, did I say that all the time?
Mayor, if there are no other questions, we'll jump right ahead into the general fund.
Well, why don't we just stop and just ask if there's any questions from anyone in the audience, any comments? At this point, understanding there'll be various points. Sure, please. Laurel, if you can come to the microphone so we can hear you. Thank you. Morning.
A couple questions. You didn't have anything up there on the labor cost?
I think we're good. Are we going to be getting that, or
we can?
Why? We can get into it now.
And the other issue I had was the water issue, the DuPage Water Commission, which I followed quite closely during the issues that we were having up there. And we are members, we pay a fee to the DuPage mayors and managers. And we have lobbyists that we've paid in the past, and that's one thing that we have with the mayors and managers. Why isn't that involved at all with the DuPage Water Commission issue in the past and moving forward? And as well as we have water towers here all over town. We don't use them at all. We don't use them for the fire department. We have water here that we have a stormwater issue because the groundwater's high. We aren't pulling any of our water out from under us, and we're not using any of the water in our water towers. So those are
I think
comments.
we're using the water in our water towers. I used it this morning when I brushed my teeth.
The Water Commission is giving us water.
Well, but we store it in the water towers. That's what they're for.
The water towers provide the pressure head, if you will, to actually run the service, and so when you turn your faucet on, it actually comes out.
Okay, what about from under us? We're not using any of that.
No, we don't use
Not using our
groundwater.
wells, right.
And actually, there's state laws that regulate that.
Before we had DuPage Water?
Well, there's a lot of situations where wells have to be capped in order for people to go onto water.
That's what I mean.
Right. Well,
That's what I'm speaking
yeah, I mean, there are fewer and fewer wells around. That's true.
I think we can touch on that description when we get to the
discussion.
water, so Nan
Yeah.
can make a note of that. Just
Yeah, no, we definitely want to get back to the water topic because the cost of water is driven by DuPage County Water Commission. Primarily, it's what the city of Chicago charges for the water they sell to DuPage Water Commission, which then sells it to us. So when Chicago jacks up the price by what it did, there's your increase. City of Chicago's got the keys to the gateway, a thing called Lake Michigan.
One more thing, Mayor. DuPage mayors and managers, certainly does their best to speak collectively, but they can't do anything in terms of telling others what to charge somebody. So it just so we're not conflating subject matters, there's DuPage Water Commission, which is really just a management entity for the infrastructure associated with getting the water from Chicago to the suburbs. There's DuPage Mayors and Managers, which is an advocacy group. Neither one of them has the ability to just sort of tell Chicago what to charge.
Correct. Thanks for the clarification. Other questions, comments at this point? Obviously, we've got a lot more to cover. Thank you for those comments. Dave?
Thank you, Mayor. Now we will present the general fund and related funds as a group that you see here in front of you. I would call your attention, if you want to follow along in the books, on the general fund, you can find it in section 4, page number 2. Our general fund is our primary and main operating fund. Most of the services we provide are paid for out of this fund. It does have multiple revenue sources, and we have been implementing recommendations from our long-range plan over the last several years that are designed to keep costs down while we continue to provide the valued services needed in this community. We do so by trying to increase operating efficiencies, reduce personnel expenses, and partner with others. A quick summary of the general fund is shown on the screen here. I did mention earlier that it is a balanced general fund. You can see that the revenues and expenses in this fund are proposed budgeted to be equal at $44.8 million. More good news here, the ending budgeted balance at the end of 15 will be just shy of $17 million, which is within our target amount for fund balance, also known as reserves. And it's also consistent with Standard & Poor's recommendations for us to maintain our AAA bond rating. So balanced and the right amount of reserves is how I would describe this fund. I have on the screen a quick snapshot of general fund revenues, money into the fund over the last several years. I'll call your attention to the far right, which is that $44.82 million for general fund revenues. And you look back over that line over the past few years, you'll see very modest growth in general fund revenues. That trend continues with the FY15 budget. Revenues are budgeted to increase about 2.4% over last year's budget, which is about 1.3% over what we estimate the revenues will be as we end FY14. This modest increase in revenue is really driven by three sources: the slow recovery of sales tax and home rule sales tax coming out of the Great Recession, and state income tax, which is also growing modestly. Those are the key drivers of the revenues in the general fund. On the expense side, I also have a similar graph showing trends of expenses over the last few years. On the far right is the $44.82 million in budgeted expenses for FY15, and the same story of modest growth in expenses over the last several years. The expenses for FY15 are budgeted to increase just over 2.5% over last year's budget, and about 2.1% over where we expect to end FY14. The drivers of this expense increases. Personnel expenses are up under 0.25%. That does account for budgeted increases in personnel costs of 3% for wages and 3.8% for benefit costs. But what's driving or curtailing the expense increase is the same story I told about police and fire pension fund costs, which are down this year. Also in FY15, our costs and contributions to the pension funds for non-public safety are also down. So that's the IMRF reference here on the screen. So there are still some expense increases that Ms. Bowen talked about, 3% for wages, 3.8% for benefit costs, offset by decreases in pension costs, netting at about a 0.21% increase. The non-personnel side of our general fund is up, budgeted to be up almost 11.3%. This is a number that will seem out of line if you've been watching us over the last several years, which has been single-digit inflation. There is an issue here that we talked about over the summer. All of this non-personnel expense increase is driven by risk risk-related expenses that we talked about over the summer. So when we said we would increase the general fund contribution to the risk fund, that is 100% the driver of this 11% increase. So in summary, the general fund is balanced with revenues and expenses equal at $44.8 million, and our ending balance is within the target. Mayor, happy to answer any questions or comments.
Thank you. Do you want to also just touch upon, and I think you did in the very beginning as part of the summary, is the staffing reduction?
Yes, village-wide, the staffing reduction of 3.6 full-time equivalents is proposed. The main driver of that is in 2 weeks, the village will be out of the business of operating the Grove commuter shuttle bus system. It will be completely operated by PACE, same system, same service, same routes, potentially maybe even the same drivers. PACE will be operating it through a subcontractor called First Student of Westmont. Because we've gotten out of that business and are still providing that service through another government, we no longer need the personnel required to operate that system, and that accounts for all of the 3.6 full-time equivalent reduction in staffing. We also have switched staffing where we are choosing not to fill a director-level position in community development. The two division managers that introduced themselves here today are doing an outstanding job of doing all those functions. And we're actually pushing some work down in the org chart by trading the director position for a management analyst position that will work out of the manager's office but support operations in a variety of departments. We find this to be much more effective and cost-effective use of staffing expenses.
Thank you. Other questions from the council? Any questions on things so far? Ms. Bowen?
Must I come to the microphone?
Well,
People at home need to hear you.
Yeah. We got a seat for you right here.
I don't need a seat. I'd like to know what the average pay increase is for the labor at the Village Hall.
3%. That's what's budgeted. What ends up happening, though, is we budget 3%. We get about halfway through the year when raises are due, and we analyze the condition of all of our funds, including the general fund, and we give out raises based on performance and financial position of the village. Some of our labor rate increases are set by contract. The other ones are at the discretion of the village manager, and we take a look at those before we give out any raises.
So it's not entirely a merit increase?
All increases for non-contractually bound employees are merit-based.
You said based on the financial condition
Correct.
also?
Both merit and our ability to pay.
So that's not entirely merit?
Well, I think what the manager's saying is that if we don't have the ability to pay, then even if there's merit, there's not an ability to pay. I think that's what he's saying. I don't think he's
Correct.
suggesting that someone will get a guaranteed bonus just because the village did well. They would still have to earn it.
I think you should compare this with the private sector when you're looking at 3%. I don't think that many people in the private sector are making 3%. And when you say based on the financial condition of the village, you pass that on to the resident. I think everybody should realize that, and I think the managers ought to as well.
Other comments? Good morning, Mr. Waldeck.
Good morning. For the record, Bill Waldeck, 1409 Willard. You mentioned the commuter shuttle and the loss of jobs there. You're also eliminating the transportation fund. So I hope somewhere in this conversation, some years ago, there was a increase in the gas tax to save the commuter shuttle. So at the appropriate time, if you wouldn't mind explaining what's going to happen with that portion of gas tax that was used for the shuttle, what's it going to be used for now, or are you going to cut it?
The quick answer that you hear about later is it's proposed to be funding the facilities.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions, comments at this juncture? Morning, Mr. Falish.
Good morning, Falish, 820 Prairie. You know, our director got a $10,000 raise in salary, $10,000 bonus. That, if you add that up, that's about almost $10 an hour. That seems a little excessive to me, and because the the mayor wants to raise, Chicago's mayor wants to have the salary be $10. That's a lot of money. And I just wonder why we have an assistant attorney when we have any problems. You go to an outside attorney. So why do we need two attorneys? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valish. I'll just touch upon that last point real quickly. We have looked over at least the 10 or so years that I've been involved with the village as the best way to handle the legal needs of the village. Some communities have no in-house attorneys. They do everything outside. There's obviously a cost and a convenience cost to that. Working in the legal system in the outside world, the rates are high and they go up, so you have to balance the cost of engaging outside counsel and the inability to have somebody who's truly part of your organization and focused on your organization and not multiple different organizations with what is the best approach in doing that from an in-house standpoint. Other communities such as Naperville have sizable in-house law departments, and I think every community looks at it and tries to balance the needs of the community with the needs of the organization based on their particular litigation and legal profile. But that's something we look at all the time. So we have, yes, periodically looked at what would be the costs and benefits of having the entire legal function outsourced versus the way we do it now, and we've consistently found that the way we do it right now and have been doing it is the right balance. But it's definitely something we look at, because if it could be done less expensively and more efficiently by doing it differently, you betcha we'd be considering that. Other questions or comments at this juncture? Thank you.
I'd like to call up our Finance Director, Judy Butney, to present the funds related to the general fund.
Thanks, Dave.
Good morning.
Good morning. I am going to be covering those funds that support the general fund. And we'll start with the health insurance fund, which can be found on page 4-6. The 2014 estimated expenses are $6,857,000, and the 2015 budget is $7,103,000. This is a 3.6% increase, which is below the industry standard of 7 to 8%. And as such, the village is going to continue with its wellness initiatives, which has contained costs for this fund. And Council, you'll be seeing the renewal for the insurance on Tuesday night's agenda. Risk management, 2014 estimated expenses, $2,754,000. Oh, that's on page 4-8. And 2015 budget, $2,656,000. There were some large claims settled in 2014, which accounts for the difference. As was discussed this summer, and as Dave pointed out a little earlier, the risk fund was the focus during long-range planning, and we increased contributions of a special transfer in 2014 by $1.9 million, and we're increasing contributions from the general fund and other funds to maintain the positive cash balance in the 2015 budget also. Of course, in this fund, we are going to continue with all the safety initiatives that the risk manager has been working on. The Fleet Services Fund on page 4-11 is 2014 estimated expenses of $2,029,000 and 2015 budget expenses of $1,859,000. You can see, comparing to the budget, the 2014 expenses were higher due to the extreme winter and the impact that that had on the village's fleet. Items of note in the 2015 budget, the fleet has been reduced due to the elimination of the Grove commuter shuttle. And for the first 8 months of 2014, the village has seen a reduction in fuel of 5.3%. This has contributed to the alternative fuels.
Can I just stop you there for a second?
Yes.
So the reduced numbers for fuel, just to make sure I understood you, is an increased usage of alternative fuels.
Yes,
so
we have,
when we talk about traditional fuel, we're talking about diesel and gasoline.
Right. That's
gone down because the villages have increasingly been using biodiesel, and CNG, and other sources of
Exactly,
alternative
Mayor.
fuels.
exactly. There's some numbers within the budget. I think we have 33 CNG vehicles right now, which is great. The Equipment Replacement Fund on page 4-12, 2014 estimated expenses of $1,465,000 and budget of $1,821,000. The expenses in this fund are lumpy depending on when various pieces of equipment will be replaced. But one of the purposes of this fund is to allow the equipment expenses in the general fund to be smooth and predictable. There's a well-established but flexible plan in place to replace equipment. But each year, the schedule is assessed to determine if the item should still be replaced or deferred to a future year. And then again, prior to the bidding process, the fleet team gets together and reviews the vehicle purchases prior to that bidding process. Next, the police and fire pension funds, 4-17 through 19. These funds are under the purview of autonomous pension boards, and the makeup of those boards are set by the state law, as are the benefits, which Dave was discussing earlier. The village council doesn't control these budgets. Those are controlled by these boards. These are designated trust funds for the safekeeping and operations of the pensions, and the way that the village can affect the impact of these funds is through the staffing level and salaries.
Judy, can you just touch on how the police and fire pension boards are comprised, who's on them,
Yes.
how they're talked about, and how they meet?
Well, there's 5 members of each board. 3 of the members are elected from, in the case of the fire, from the firefighters. 1 is from a retiree, and the other 2 are active members. 2 members appointed by the village council. They are the ones that meet on a quarterly basis to manage the investments, to review the budgets, and everything to do with the funds, disability hearings, etc.
Thanks.
These funds are financially sound. They are professionally managed by professional investment managers.
Just for clarification, our funds are financially
Yes,
sound.
they are. Yes, they are.
Correct.
They are. Actually, right now, at August 31st, the fire pension fund has $45 million in assets, and the police has $49. That's actually and coincidentally in both a 16-to-1 ratio of assets to benefits paid, which is very sound. And a note: the village contributes 100% of annual required contributions. These calculations are performed by an actuary.
Just to augment that last point, not only do we contribute 100% of what's required, we actually contribute slightly more than the state minimums, because the state minimums are targeted towards hitting a 90% funded level, and we think reaching 90% is not the correct target, 100% is the correct target. So both of these funds are right on track to achieve the 100% funding in the designated year that it's supposed to hit the 100% funding. So we get a lot of questions about percent funded, 50, 60%. Really what you need to understand about these funds is because they're so well managed, because they have the 16-to-1 ratio that Judy talked about, they are both right on track. And in fact, the investment manager for both funds noted to the fund managers that both of these funds performed in the top 5 in the entire states last year. So very well managed, great returns. The village doesn't really have a lot of choice in these budgets, and in fact, the budgets are approved by the boards and then forwarded to, for basically placement in this document.
That's worth underscoring, because I'm sure, I know everybody at this table and everybody in the room has probably heard about efforts at public safety pension reform at the state level and the need to do something, because otherwise the funds will become unsustainable for a number of different organizations, municipalities included. And one of the criticisms I hear periodically as to why public safety pension reform should not take place is because it's the municipality's fault for not properly funding their pensions. Sure, there are some out there that haven't done that, but I think it's worth repeating that the Village of Downers Grove has. So when we talk about public safety pension reform, this is not a problem that we created. We have done what we need to do, and I think that statistic you just mentioned of being in the top 5%
in the performance last year, yes,
in the state, I mean, so when we talk about the need for public safety pension reform, it's not because there's been some problem that we've created by not properly funding things. We've done that. It's a bigger issue that continues to hit the state stage in terms of proposals for potential reform. There are different proposals that have been made in Springfield that continues to be a hot topic. The upcoming election, I think, is one reason why we're not going to see anything soon until that's passed. The other issue is you may be aware that there are some legal challenges right now to some pension reform attempts that have been made in a different area that have been challenged. Those legal battles are still winding through as to whether they're constitutional or not. I think a lot of the other proposed reform measures are waiting to see how the courts will rule on what's been done so far. And then another big factor in the whole mix is the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago has its own problems and is leading pension reform that, candidly, is all focused about Chicago and not necessarily the rest of the state. But Downers Grove, other municipalities in DuPage County through both themselves, DuPage mayors and managers, the Commissioner Barnett mentioned, the Metropolitan Mayors Caucus, the Illinois Municipal League, are all continuing to press the issue of public safety pension reform as much as possible. And it's important to recognize that this is not something that anyone is saying that our first responders are not deserving of a fair pension, but some of the sweeteners that the politicians in Springfield have put in over the last 10 years have just made it unsustainable. So something needs to be done, or it won't be there for the first responders or the municipalities who won't be able to continue to fund it. But that's all been tied up right now for a lot of the reasons I just mentioned, but just want to let everyone know that that continues to be a big topic, and how that ultimately gets resolved will have a big impact on these funds.
Mayor, we're happy to answer any questions about the general fund or any of the related supporting funds.
Thank you. Questions from the council on these topics?
I just want to know if lumpy is a technical finance term.
Extremely technical.
All right, thanks. I'll put that in my notes here.
Yeah, that was funny.
I usually associate that with mattresses and mashed potatoes.
But you did say smooth right after that.
That's
too,
right.
so-
Commissioner?
Hi, on the equipment replacement fund, I see in line 8, we're going from, 1,280,000, and then to this is the FY14 estimate, and the FY15 proposed budget is 1,262,000 on that line. I see the note, it says reflects charges to village departments for their cost of equipment, but then it's projected to increase. So just wanted to clarify why that would be.
Sure. We operate a equipment replacement fund where each year we take some money from primarily the general fund and some of the other operating funds, and we put it into this fund. We try to do that in a predictable manner. And generally, those transfers out of those funds into the equipment replacement fund are increasing at a modest rate.
Okay.
And that's what you see as revenues into this fund.
Right.
Then what we do with that money is we pool it and use it as we need it to replace vehicles and other equipment. So in any given year, the expenses in this fund could be high or low, and they vary over time. So smooth money in from other funds, and then, as Judy said, lumpy expenses out. We're in a period where the last 3 or 4 years, the expenses in this fund have been higher than the revenue. That actually will change in the next several years, where the revenues will be higher than the expenses, and you'll get the effect of smoothing out that line.
With regard to the risk fund, Judy, you mentioned that we're going to be continuing with the safety initiatives. I know that we've seen a decrease in workers' comp claims and whatnot. I wonder if you could detail a little bit of the information and the change that we've seen.
Yes. While we have implemented many risk management and safety enhancements village-wide, and they have been effective in reducing the number of claims or mitigating an increase in the number of claims. The challenge is that the cost per claim continues to climb. So while we've had a lot of successes in many areas, reduction in vehicle crashes, holding steady on the number of workers' comp claims, the costs continue to rise. That has a lot to do with the way doctors, other health professionals are allowed to charge for these medical services under Illinois state law and some of the laws regarding the liability that is placed on municipalities in settling these cases. So there's a lot of success we've been having, but also there's a lot of cost drivers that continue to put pressure, having those expense lines increase. And that's what we talked about over the summer and why we're putting more and more money into the risk fund at the same time, trying to reduce the amount of injuries.
So it's in line with the common theme of we're doing everything we can to keep things in line, and folks in Springfield may or may not be helping us out.
That's part of the issue, yes, absolutely.
You're being way too polite.
It may not. But it may not.
I thought I'd leave the door open so that they have the opportunity.
If you leave the door open, they might go through it. Other questions on any of these funds, or of Judy?
Mayor, just that bears repeating Greg's point, he was way too pleasant, is that the village, from an allocation of budget standpoint, is doing the right thing. From a program standpoint, to put a really conscious effort on reducing anything associated with this from a claim standpoint, are seeing successes. As with many things, unfortunately, that we have to deal with, whether it's the city of Chicago or it's Springfield, we're in somewhat of a reactionary mode, and that's one of the things that happens. It's a darn shame because everybody that stood up and said their name in this room is really working hard and doing good work that's showing actual results. But Springfield and Chicago are tough to deal with. So.
But we keep trying.
We don't have any choice, do we?
Keep trying. No, we don't. We keep trying. Before Judy leaves, any questions on what's been presented so far? Okay, thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll make a quick change in our presentation materials, and we will call up our Public Works Director, Nan Newland, to make a presentation, lead a discussion regarding stormwater, water, and capital funds. I'd like to introduce our Public Works Director, Nan Newland, who will talk about stormwater, water, and other capital funds.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'd also like to introduce, we have two assistant directors in Public Works here today. Stan Balicki oversees our operations side. Andy Sikich oversees our engineering side. And if we get into some technical questions from anybody, I may be calling on them. They work with these areas every day. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the budget that is related to the village's infrastructure this morning. This is primarily found in three funds: stormwater, water, and the capital projects fund. This pie chart is shown on page 1-09 of the budget message and shows the planned capital expenditures for our infrastructure system in 2015. They total about $23.5 million investment. We have about 19% of that in stormwater, 24% of that in water, 40% in streets, and the remaining 17% for sidewalks, parking facilities, major buildings, traffic signals, and streetlights. First, we're going to focus on our stormwater fund, and before we get into 2015, I thought I'd just show you a couple of highlights from this year. We're still finishing some projects, but we've accomplished quite a few already. These are just a couple of examples. We completed work at almost completed work at Hill and Grand, which was a very large head wall replacement by Whittier School. This project is very impressive. It allows for significantly more water to enter the storm sewer system at this location. It reduces the frequency of clogging. As you can see, the old structure was a vertical structure, so a lot of the debris that hit against that head wall got caught there and clogged the head wall, and it prevented flow in this system. We reduced the risk of injury. We provided stream bank stabilization, and we installed a remote camera there so our field crews can see that location from their home, from the office, wherever they happen to be during large storms. So that was a great project to get finished this year. The next project I just wanted to show you a little bit this morning also, this is at Valley View Pond. This is along Prentice Creek. Over many years, a lot of sediment had deposited in this area that had been enlarged when this subdivision was built. The sediment caused water to be very shallow. It led to poor water quality and a lot of poor smells in this neighborhood. We did address this by some naturalization and rechannelizing of this stream, and it's looking much better today, as you can see in the photograph. The last photo, I just wanted to show you another stormwater project that is just about complete this year. This is along with a street reconstruction that we did at Brook and Center up north of Butterfield and east of Finley. This addressed a long-standing drainage problem up in this area. This included adding underground storage and reconfiguring some storm sewers to alleviate surcharging of the storm sewer system. These three projects, as well as all the other projects we completed in 2014, improve the operation of the village's system and reduce flooding throughout the village. As long as a summary of our expenses and revenues for 2015 are included here, we have a proposed 8.7% increase in the stormwater utility fee. We propose revenues in this fund of $4.58 million. The major expenses are shown at the bottom of this slide and include debt service, operations and maintenance, and capital projects for a total of $7.63 million. We are spending down a fund balance in this fund for capital projects in 2015, and with a proposed revenue, we will have an ending balance of $3.37 million in 2015. On this slide, we also show revenues and expenditures for a scenario if property tax-exempt parcels were to be removed from the fee, and show the resulting revenues of $4.36 million and expenditures the same at $7.63 million in 2015, for an ending balance of $3.15 million. Although we're not showing a change in expenditures in 2015, this reduction in revenues would result in an impact in future 2016 and beyond projects with a reduction in revenues. We are currently analyzing that model, and we'll have results shortly that will show the impact on projects we'll be able to complete in the future after 2015.
So that's probably worth just repeating, is that if proposed changes to the scope of the stormwater utility fee are implemented, they would not have an immediate impact upon the expenditures in fiscal 15 for stormwater projects. It would have a long-term impact, which is still being analyzed.
Correct.
That's correct. Last Tuesday, when the council talked about this, we said we would do three things based on your direction. One was we would show you the impact on the FY15 budget. That's here. No immediate impact on the expenses, but an impact on the ending balance in the fund. Two other things we would update the long-term operating model for your discussion at a future date, and we would prepare ordinances so you could see what that would look like if the property tax exempts were omitted. Those two next steps are coming in the coming weeks, and there'll be opportunity to have that discussion, but we do have the impact of the FY15 budget here.
And am I correct that one of the reasons why there is no immediate impact in fiscal 2015 is because, I think as you mentioned, we're spending down bond proceeds that we have, or reserves that we have for stormwater, that at least for 2015 allow us to have no reduction in expenditures for maintenance and capital projects in the stormwater area, but we're talking about a long term. Because eventually those reserves or those proceeds won't be there anymore, and that's when the impact will kick in.
Right, unless we adjust the other things in the model,
right.
Correct.
Understood, which is what we're looking at.
Correct. We do have some additional information to show you about the projects that are planned for 15.
Yes, I just wanted to give you some of the projects that we're looking at to do next year, or 2015. We have some stream bank stabilization projects, St. Joe's Creek and Lacey Creeks. We have some structure replacements, some water quality improvements. We also have drainage improvements in Clyde Estates that will be completed in conjunction with road reconstruction in that neighborhood in 2015. We have drainage improvements at Washington and Chicago. We also have a couple of additional head wall replacements at Gilbert and Brookbank and Grand and 55th Street. The last two slides in stormwater capital projects is the recurring annual type of work and the ongoing work, basically stabilization work from prior projects. So we have stormwater sewer replacement program. We have land acquisition and funding for the engineering and land acquisition for the projects identified in the 2013 flood study. We also have stormwater quality projects and the cost share projects. And that concludes my slides on the stormwater fund. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Questions on stormwater fund?
Go ahead. Two things. One is just to pick up on what the mayor was talking about and the idea of future spending in the stormwater fund. Obviously, this is a point where I have some disagreement with my colleagues about the future effects. Just to remind everybody, though, that what we're talking about are the future effect of a decrease in revenue on the plan as it sits today. That second part is kind of important. We have plans that get fuzzier as the time period extends. That's one thing. We've got a lot of evidence of that. We also have the ability to make stormwater utility rates whatever we want. We have the ability to bond at, enormous numbers. I mean, it's worth noting whether we're talking about stormwater or facilities or any other things before people get nervous about debt. The village's ability to bond is in the probably hundreds of millions of dollars, and we're not. So there's a lot of restraint being exhibited that also provides a little bit of freedom on the back end should we get 6 years down the line and wish we had that $200,000. 5 years, which is pretty far down the road in terms of planning and seeing the net effects of changes, is less than half of what we spent a week ago on water meters. So just for some perspective on the magnitude of this, it starts to sound like a lot of money, and I don't want to be the opposite of Everett Dirksen, but it is a lot of money, but it's not in the grand scheme of things. I just think the magnitude of it is important to understand. Even future bonding ability, as attributed to $200,000 a year, is relatively small in the village's ability to bond and the revenue sources down the road that are unpredictable. One more thing, Mayor, if you'll indulge me, not with stormwater, just a thought that I had this morning, we probably should have mentioned at the beginning. For those reading this book with us, I wanted to highlight two things. There's a front section, which you obviously have seen, that kind of briefly touches on some of the highlights. Then there's a little later section that goes into details on the funds, of which the first page talks about, again, some of the highlights. Any of those things, as you go home and you go back and say what was said, or I wonder what they were talking about, any of those things, if you need more information or you'd like more information, don't hesitate to ask. We'll certainly get it for you. There's a lot of information here. There's also a lot of information on any one line that is much longer than we never put in a document. And so we've tried to highlight the things that we think are driving these funds and to highlight the things that we think are noteworthy of the last year or two worth of expenditures. There's a lot more, and we don't mean to tell everybody that this is it, and read this and understand it. We're happy to get into any of these things in detail.
Fair point, and there will be multiple opportunities to do just that, first of which is today, but certainly by no means the last.
I wasn't planning on going down this particular trail, but since we got partway down there, plans get fuzzier the further you get down the road, 5-10 years. But the village has gotten pretty good at budgeting. The village has won several awards for it. And the experience with stormwater, on the revenue side at least, is that village projections have been within a couple percent. That's a long way of saying we're pretty good at this. And I think when the village staff tells us that we're cutting bonding authority in half by doing certain things, and we're looking just a couple of years out, for the first set of bonds being in 2017, I think we have to take that seriously. But to shift to the question that I actually was going to ask, a couple of slides forward was listed about $800,000 worth of grants. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little about that.
That's grants that are available from the federal government in response to the flooding we had in 2013, and we can use that for property acquisition for properties that are in the floodway.
Can I just interject and ask that same question with respect to any water quality grants through DuPage County? So I know that those become available, and it's highly competitive, but...
It's very competitive. We apply every time. We're going to continue to apply. Some of it is kind of, if you didn't get awarded last year, they're trying to get everybody, so we're keeping our projects in line and hoping to get some of that money as well.
I think it's important, and thank you for bringing that point up, that we also look for every possible outside source we can, such either the federal government or through DuPage County, for additional stormwater funding from outside our borders whenever we can get it.
I just want to expand quickly on Bob and Nan's, Bob's point and Nan's slides. The section 6 of this book is the Community Investment Program, and in that section there are even further lists and descriptions of the projects that are contemplated for next year and beyond. We went through that list pretty quick, and if you saw something in your neighborhood or somewhere that you have an interest in, you can get a lot more information, not only in this book, but also online. And a quick comment maybe from our staff about prioritization of projects and how that plays into the plan and making it less fuzzy for the next year and beyond. We are somewhat reactionary, I think, as Commissioner Barnett has said. We certainly reacted. I saw another head wall replacement at 55th and Grand, closer to Barth Pond. We do take into account what's already been done, and a lot of times with these stormwater projects, many of the high priority projects have already been completed with great success. We're not working on some high, medium, and now low. Once a project's in, it affects how the low or even smaller projects are functioning, and a medium priority project may actually take care of some of the smaller priority projects. So each time a shovel goes in the ground anywhere in the village, especially in the specific watersheds that are outlined in the WIPs, we're able to see how that change affects stormwater issues and projects that have come up over the years. And those issues, obviously, in our last big storm change, and the focus can change around different parts of town. So I think it's important to note how we prioritize, when we prioritize these projects, and how that relates to the plan and its fuzziness going forward.
The prioritization in stormwater starts with identifying should we prioritize maintenance activities, day-to-day cleaning, replacement of pipes, versus new capital projects, large capital projects. We make that decision in a collective discussion. That's the model we've been talking about. Unlike our street system, there's no compelling reason to pick maintenance over capital. It's just what's the right balance for your community, because in a long-term approach, the cost remains relatively the same whether you prioritize maintenance over capital or vice versa. The second cut of prioritization has to do with, once you've identified how much money you want to spend on capital projects, which capital projects should you do? Earlier this year, we had a very innovative approach to prioritizing those capital projects, and the system we came up with prioritizes based on the costs and benefits on a per impervious square foot basis. What does that mean? It means that the way we prioritize capital projects, the spending, is absolutely aligned with how we generate revenue. Both are now based on the amount of impervious area in a given area and how well these capital projects serve that area. So it's a little bit technical, but at the end of the day, what it says is the way we generate revenue is aligned with the way we spend the revenue and how we prioritize projects.
Can I ask a question, Nan? This grant, have we received it already? Or, I mean, is it confirmed that we're going to get that?
Yes.
And then some grants you get this money and then you just have to proof up at the end? Or do we have to say this is going to be designated for this? Can we?
It can only be used for the purchase of those properties. And what we're doing now, and it's voluntary purchase, so we are continuing to work with the property owners to identify if those specific properties are going to be purchased, if they want to sell, negotiating prices, and once that's confirmed, that grant will pay us back a proportion of that cost. So if we buy less properties, we'll get less grant money. It's the maximum we could get.
Okay, thanks.
But also what we put in there for cost is the maximum we would spend as well.
Okay.
Dave, you said, excuse me, Dave, you said a second ago that there's no compelling reason to prioritize maintenance over capital or vice versa. With regard to maintenance, what you're saying then is that the maintenance activity we're doing doesn't necessarily extend the life of the system that's being maintained. Is that fair to say?
The maintenance sometimes would extend the life of the system, but the replacement cost after inflation adjustments is the same. What do I mean by that? Well, we learned in the last couple of years that if you let the condition of your roads drop to the point that you have to reconstruct them and replace them totally, it costs about 4 times more to do a replacement than a maintenance activity. What we found in the stormwater system is the cost of replacing a pipe or a structure, but for inflation, is the same no matter when you do it. What that means then is it allows the council to have a policy discussion about what's the best mix of maintenance and new capital projects for our community, and there's no compelling cost driver on the replacement side.
Great, thanks.
But maintenance activities in some neighborhoods will have a higher benefit than maybe even a replacement.
That's correct.
That sounds really weird as you say it, but it could.
Yeah, the operational
Yeah.
performance is what.
Yeah, you want to make sure that it's functioning.
You want to make sure that if you don't do your maintenance activities, the pipes, the storm sewers, the detention basins in a given neighborhood, they won't be as effective. They'll become clogged, they won't work as well. And that's the balancing act and the policy decision we've been talking about over the last several months.
And luckily, we have some very seasoned professionals who know how to find that equation and make it the best choice for not only all the neighborhoods and different styles of neighborhoods we have across the village, but using history that we have with our staff and actually boots-on-the-ground folks who pull the grates off and see what's going on in the system and climb down in those giant structures that we're building at Brook and Center to really see how they're functioning and see what's going on.
Correct.
Mayor, another thing. I want to pick up on that a little bit and also be like the downer guy in the meeting. One of the things that's different about this compared to streets that's important, I think, for residents to understand, and I don't mean this to sound so down, but I just want expectations to be well set and understood. When you fix a street, you know what the street's service demands are going to be tomorrow. And so you have this high level of confidence that the work you just did, the capital you just invested, will in fact meet the service demand of tomorrow. With the stormwater, because what you're dealing is an ability to react to weather. There's one thing that just needs to remain, I think, in everybody's mind as it relates to this. We're going to invest millions and millions of dollars. We have and are going to continue to. The net effect is to reduce the frequency or likelihood of a tough event for everybody, a 2013 event. It does not mean prevent them from happening. It does not mean eliminate them. And there's a big difference between streets and stormwater. So when we're spending 20% of our budget on stormwater and then next spring everybody's flooded again, it's important to remember that that's not a function of bad engineering, bad investment, money that didn't work. It's the nature of dealing with trying to be able to react to nature. So it's just I know that's probably not the most exciting thing to talk about this morning, but it's huge investments of millions of dollars of taxpayer money, and it really is the right thing to do. It may still mean that not too far down the line, in areas where we just did work, there will still be things underwater. We're trying to minimize that, trying to put the water in better spots, but it's nature and it's rain. So just...
Our friends in Clarendon Hills, in dealing with the same issue, came up with the phrase that in stormwater, you're in the business of making improvements, not creating solutions. And it speaks to what you said. There's always a storm event that's bigger than whatever size storm system you build.
Just one thing I do want to point out that clearly you can't argue that the farther you look into the future, things are going to be more and more fuzzy. All you have to do is look at any of the movies out of Hollywood that predicted things would have happened by 1990. Robots from Mars would have been here by now if you look at the movie Blade Runner. That obviously didn't happen. So the more you try to predict the future, the less accurate you get. But one of the things I think that we are proactive about and have been historically proactive about in terms of trying to anticipate an uncertain future that becomes more uncertain the farther you go out is by maintaining flexibility and by keeping options open and not closing doors, not curtailing what our options are. And whether we're talking about capital projects or we're talking about dealing with threats from Springfield, such as an impact on the LDGDF, we try to maintain flexibility. We try to keep options open. We don't close doors because that limits our ability to be proactive in an uncertain world. So regardless of how good we are at predicting the future, nobody's perfect at that. If they were, we'd all be doing something else. But I think we are proactive in one respect in that regard, is by maintaining flexibility in our options and our revenue streams and not foreclosing them prematurely. Any other questions on what's been discussed so far while Nan is here? Questions or comments from the audience, please?
My question has evolved listening to all of you involved here. I see in the book there's 214 detention areas in the village. I happen to live by one. And yeah, 2013, it almost breached the walls. And it did go down, but it's going slower and slower. So my question has evolved to, is there a maintenance program that is in place to come and check to see what's going on? I did call the village once because it seems to back up much more frequently. It does drain very slow. So that's my question.
Where are you located?
I was just going to say, which one in particular?
I am in a townhome complex, Ashley Court off of Belmont. In the back, the complex is about 14 years old now, never been touched. And I say, 2013 was scary. Since then, it's been rising, but going down. Very, very.
Do you know if it's a detention facility that is privately owned by that development?
Well, I can't answer the question. I'm having a feeling that the contract receivers in this case was forced to build it. Because we get it, we're on a low spot. We get it from Howard Street above us. Everything is collecting down there, so we can't be responsible for all that.
I ask because there has been a challenge that the village, and the manager and Nan will jump in and correct me, but one of the challenges the village has had over the last many decades is there are a lot of privately built detention facilities that were built because they were required to be built, but they are technically the ownership and responsibility of the
I think it's an easement to the village.
I don't know.
I'm
That's
pretty sure
the question I have, is it depending who has, some of them we have control over, some of them we don't. That's why I asked the question.
I think reading through our documents, it is an easement to the village.
Yeah, Nan probably knows the answer to that better than I do.
We do manage them in two ways. One is just to come out in response to calls. The second way, we're building a whole inventory of all the basins and all the storm sewers out there, because as the mayor said, it's a very complex system of public and private ownership, and sometimes private ownership where we do certain things. So we're establishing that inventory, and we're also establishing a regular inspection, whether it's public or private, to make sure it's being maintained. So we're well on our way with that, and as I said, we will respond. If you just call us, we'll go out and check storm lines, but we are developing that ongoing regular maintenance of all the facilities in the village, and that's part of what the O&M costs go for.
Right. I mean, the reality is that a lot of them were private, and there were some issues about control and access and whatnot. But what's become increasingly clear is regardless of who owns them and controls them, it ultimately impacts the village. And so, as Nan points out, we're being much more involved and engaged in trying to address those issues, because whether it's public or private, it ends up hitting everybody publicly.
The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of those basins that are privately owned have easements over them that benefit the village. And those easement rights say that the village has the right to go in there to fix them in an emergency situation, but not the obligation to own and maintain them. And that's part of the complexity Nan was talking about. So we'd like to work with your homeowners association to make sure we're on the same page on maintenance activities.
All right, I'll call Monday.
Thank you.
Okay.
Put the address back in and let you look at it.
That'd be great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing it up. Other questions or comments at this stage? Please.
I'd like somebody to speak to this memorandum to the mayor, September 22nd, 2014, to the existing plan, and it calls for an annual rate increase of approximately 8.7% per year starting in 2017.
Is this the one with respect to potential changes to the stormwater utility plan? Because they're all dated September 26th. I just make sure I got the right number.
Got it.
Yes, thank you. That's what I figured you were asking about.
Potential changes, Mayor, is that
Yes.
the one? Okay, a couple of years ago, when the village went to the stormwater utility system, where the system would be funded primarily or wholly by fees paid by properties based on their impact to the stormwater system, we put together a long-range plan showing the revenues required over time to meet expected expenses for both maintenance activities and capital replacement activities. The money generated in year one of the stormwater utility was not enough to immediately reach the recommended level of service in both categories. We put together a multi-year plan that called for revenue increases to make sure that we could achieve the recommended level of service over time. That rate of increase was about 8.7% per year on the fee increases. That is the current plan we're working on and working from. So for the last, the stormwater utility was created in 2013. 2014 was the first year of rate increases. 2015 would be the second year of rate increases. This memo speaks to a concept of deciding between priorities for maintenance and priorities for capital spending. And what it does is it gives two alternatives that would take a set amount of money in revenues and shift it from capital projects and more towards maintenance. And that's what this memo explains.
And thank you. I think one thing to recall is that when the utility went into place, these were planned increases or projected increases.
Correct.
There was a funding level for identified projects that was estimated, and yes, it was an estimate. We don't know until we get there. That's no different than anything else. But it was an estimate of what the needs would be for stormwater maintenance and infrastructure. There was a funding amount that was estimated to be required in order to meet those needs. And rather than putting in a fee in place right up front that was designed to capture all those dollars to meet that funding need immediately, which could have been done, it was decided to instead phase it in over time through a series of planned increases. So one of the things I think it needs to be reminded is when there's discussion of increases in the stormwater utility, it isn't as though every year we sit around and, gee, how much can we raise this? It literally was a plan based on an identified set of needs, an estimated cost associated with those needs, and what the funding would be to get there. And then rather than just picking a dollar amount that would get all that money right up front and boom, put it in a fund and let's get the projects done and then see how we perform over time. It might come in higher, it might come in lower. We'll find out once we get into the field. It was designed to have those planned increases over time to get to that funding level. So the increases are sort of built into the program and planned for in order to get to the dollar amount necessary to achieve the projects that we reasonably expect to have done. Of course, over every year, we have this meeting because we have to have a budget, but we also then have a little bit more experience as to what actually happened. We know what things actually cost in terms of things that went out for bid. We know what the actual, when we have an expectation of what it'll cost, but just like anything else, you have a budget and you go to the store to buy something, if you're able to find it on sale, well, guess what? It costs you a little bit less. So if the project costs a little bit less, then that savings or lower costs will get factored back into what are our estimates of the total costs of the program for the identified needs. If needs change, if we have storm events like in 2013 and that changes the needs, then the whole thing gets updated based on actual experience. So we are dealing with a projection with estimates over a fairly lengthy period of time, and every single year we come back to the plan and look at it and say, what do we need to do to stay on that same track? Do we still need that same increase? But those increases were planned to get to a funding level necessary to get the projects done that the community has been asking for. But we adjust that every year based on real performance. So that's why we have this conversation every year, because we have a better idea of what projects cost, we have a better idea of what the impact has been for a particular project on the flooding issues. Nature intervenes every now and then and gives us new data points that we have to deal with. After 2013, there were additional projects and revised projects based on what we learned from that. But we still have a target. I think everybody can agree that it's a target. We still have a target of projects that we want to get accomplished, and we have an estimate of what the cost is to get those projects done. And then we just adjust where we're at every year based on actual information from what we learned that prior year, and a little bit more about what we know maybe in the immediate years will be costs and impacts of different projects. So this is why we talk about increases every year.
You didn't answer my question.
Well, actually, sir, with all due respect, your request was, can we talk about the memo?
Yeah, you're right.
Was there a specific question about the memo that you wanted answered?
They're going to start in 2017, 8.7% per year. That's going to compound every year. It's not going to be a flat 8.7. What's the total increase projected from 2017 on that's going to affect us as taxpayer? This is an enterprise fund. It's paid for by our fees. Mm-hmm. It's not the tax money, it's fees. So we don't even get to deduct it on our income tax. What are the fees going to increase beginning with 2017 with a compounded rate of interest for the, say, 5 years from 2017? How much are they going to cost each of us?
If you go to tab 2 in the book, tab 2, you'll see a document called Long Range Plan. If you go to page 20 on the Long Range Plan, you'll see a chart and a table. The bottom of that table shows the actual fees that are in the plan. So, actual fees in the plan, what does that mean? It means that those are the projected fee amounts that would be relooked at every year, as the mayor talked about. But they do have an actual dollar amount right here at the bottom of that page.
Yeah, this is actually a visual depiction of what I was talking about. So you'll see what the dollars are that are estimated to be necessary to complete the projects that have been identified at this point in time in 2014 as ones that will be done over this time period. So we need, in order to get those projects done, based on the best estimate we can make today, and again, we'll adjust it based on actual information, we're estimating that those dollars are going to be necessary. And so to get to those dollars, there have to be increases, because obviously without the funds, you can't do the projects.
And if you look at
that page actually answers your question directly as to what you think, what we expect right now in 2014 as what those dollars will be. That's what we expect. And that, of course, as I mentioned, gets adjusted every year based on new information, such as new rain events, new priorities, if things come in under budgets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And you can see the actual dollar amount there at the bottom of the chart as well, the fee per unit.
That's tab 2.
Page 20 on tab 2.
That's this one. Hopefully that answers your question, sir.
Waldeck again. I appreciate the fact that you're planning on resolving all these problems, that you go through all the process of projecting what the future costs and future needs would be. And I can understand that. It's something that as a homeowner or even a car owner, you should probably do at home. You know, you look at your house, you need a new, you're going to need a new roof sometime, you're going to have plumbing problems, electrical problems, so it's something we should do. But the difference between you and us is we just can't turn around and say, well, I'm going to need a roof here, I just can't turn around and say, okay, I'm going to increase my revenue by 8.5%. And I think that's the problem I have is, 8.5%. Who's making 8.5% per year just for this item? And then you have a lot of other projects. So, I mean, there's really no discussion ever on these things about the status of the residents, how much they expect in increases. Like if you're on Social Security, you got 1.5% last year. You got maybe a $20 a month raise. And how much of that is just going to increases in the village? So, part of the budgeting conversation should be the status of the residents and where they are in their income and their ability to pay what you're projecting what you need. So I appreciate that you can project 8.5%, but you got to think about the people who have to pay for it too. So, we don't have the options you have. Thank you.
Thank you. And you're right, that is something that we always have to think about, but you also need to consider the full picture. You mentioned having to replace your roof. If the roof is leaking, you either fix it or you don't. We've heard from the community countless times, in fact, you'll recall it when you were on the council, Mr. Waldeck, countless times during rain events, you've got to fix the flooding. And as Commissioner Barnett says, we're never going to fix it, so let's make it better. We don't have to do the projects. That's a simple answer to your question. But that's why this is a community conversation, because the community wants and has been calling for the village to address stormwater issues. And there's been a very serious investment in stormwater maintenance and infrastructure over the last number of years. We have made a commitment through the community to continue doing that. But like fixing your roof, it doesn't fix itself. You have to find somebody who's going to do the work, and you have to find the finance to fix the roof. Otherwise, it keeps leaking. We've had people, as you know, come to us in tears about their basements flooding. And I've heard people say, why can't you fix this faster? Why is it taking so many years to get to these projects? So it is that balance, and you're right, we need to discuss the balance, which is why we discuss it every single year as part of the budget process. How much does the community want to get done versus how much are they willing or able to pay? I mean, that's the balanced discussion that we have every single year. Because obviously, if there was, with the limits of how much construction you get done in one season, if you had unlimited resources, we could be doing stormwater projects out the year. But there's only so much you can get done, which is why these increases are phased in, not all at once, because you understand people can't just pick that up. But it is an ongoing conversation about how much maintenance and infrastructure and stormwater does the community want, which is candidly up here, versus how much the community wants to financially contribute to get there, which not surprisingly is down here. So it's trying to get to that balance. Where does that line up to where people are okay with the financial support, but also okay with the amount of projects that are getting done? And it's not just new projects, it's as importantly maintenance on existing ones, because if you don't maintain them, then they don't perform and other problems. So this is why we have this conversation every single year. It's trying to find that balance. And we do hear from folks saying, I can't afford the fee, and yes, and then we hear from people saying, my God, please fix my stormwater.
Mayor, can I just expand on that a little bit?
Absolutely.
We have three things that are taking extraordinary amounts of resources: streets, stormwater, and facilities. And the truth of the matter is that all three of those, what we're doing is trying to recover from, it depends on probably who you talk to, take your pick, 40 years perhaps, of decisions to essentially not do the maintenance necessary. So if you think about your house and the analogy of a roof, if you spent 40 years avoiding doing any maintenance, you've got a big list in front of you. And to the mayor's point, we in fact, what this process actually is a process of saying we've got probably, if your taxes were, $900 to the village, and we were going to do what we thought we should do to recover from what we haven't done for 40 years, we probably need about a $3,000 tax bill from each house. The fact is, what we're doing is trying to figure out how to get to a level of improvement that everybody expects as, it's a stewardship thing. These things that we are sitting up here and you guys have allowed us to oversee have been neglected. And we're trying to figure out how to recover. You can't do it all in one bite, which I think, frankly, the very fact that we haven't tried is recognition of the burden this places on every resident, every business, every not-for-profit, every person that lives in this town, because the burden is huge. So we're trying to make investments, but the concept, and I know I'm nitpicking on words, but the concept of increases, yes, they are obviously increases in the revenues we're trying to acquire. They're not necessarily increases as though they were all payroll increases for employees or new cars because we didn't like the old one. There's a huge component of recovery in here. A year or so ago, we had a lot of conversation about whether these increases in rates for SWU should be limited to CPI. They couldn't be less connected. There's no relationship between the reason for the revenues and the needs behind the revenues and CPI. We're trying to recover from 40 years worth of marginal neglect. That's not a word probably some folks would like to hear. But we're doing our best to exercise stewardship over the resources that belong to everybody in the village. And one of the appropriate applications of that effort is certainly not to just let stuff go. And 8.7 sounds like a ton, and it is. Make no doubt, it is. But if you go back to that table that Dave was referring to earlier, the actual need that we think is, whatever that compounded rate is. We could do that next year if we thought that was right, but it's the very act of trying to recognize what can the residents live with, what can they afford. We're trying to maximize that, to be sure, because the needs are huge. They're magnitudes of 10 times the kind of revenue sources we have. So I just want to say that, Mayor, because I don't want to leave the conversation as though there's some sort of an attempt to see what we can get away with. It's really the inverse of that. It really absolutely is the inverse of that. What we could do by law and what we need to do by technical definition is magnitudes of 10 times what we're doing. We're trying to figure out where that proper balancing point is. And it's a struggle we all deal with. I know everybody up here is a taxpayer. Everybody up here is concerned with trying to minimize that. And if you look at the levies and you look at the expenses, clearly we're doing that. There's a lot of evidence that this council and those prior in the last two or so have in fact done a really good job of that. So I guess everybody please keep that in mind. If you take a look at the original tables that we started with when Dave started the conversation, and you look at the annual rates of increase both of expense and of levy revenues, they're pretty small. Stormwater happens to be big, but those are very small total increases in revenues acquired by the village. We're doing our best to keep those down, and there's solid evidence of that. If you focus just on water or just on stormwater, they are bigger increases than probably is really demonstrative of the village's efforts to keep costs to residents down. So just please, everybody, take a second or third look at that, and look in particular at those tables early on that show a 5- and 7-year trend.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I think part of the problem is the nomenclature and using the terms increases, because people will associate that with, we're just going to raise taxes because we needed to, things cost more or whatnot, and that's really increases the wrong word. What we're really talking about is an estimated pool of dollars that are necessary to spend to get a identified pool of projects done. We have a pretty good idea what that's going to cost. Sure, the farther we go out in the future, the less certain it is, but we have a pretty good idea. And it's really a question of phasing in the payment for that over time. That's really what we're talking about. It's not so much increases. It's where does that money come from? Do we get it in 1 year? Do we get it in 15 years, 20 years? That's really the question. And there's a current plan to phase in the payment for those costs over time, kind of like a gas pedal. And every year we figure out how far you can step down on the gas. So you're going to go 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, and you can adjust that every single year. But it has the same impact as it does when you put your foot on the gas. The more you put your foot on the gas, the faster you're going to get to your goal. You take your foot off the gas, the longer it's going to take you to get to your goal. And that's kind of what this balance we're talking about. You're right, the increase language is unfortunate because it has connotations that get associated with a lot of other things, and that really isn't what this is about. This is really about identified needs with a fairly knowable cost, and how do we get to our goal of getting caught up, if you will, over what period of time, understanding that you can't do it all at once. You have to ease it in, and it's about where are we putting our foot on the gas in terms of getting to our destination, which is getting things to where they need to be in terms of proper maintenance and construction.
For me, the key way to describe it is investment. And I think we've heard several people say it, but I'd like to highlight that point, whether it's roads, stormwater, what have you, especially when you look at stormwater, to bring it down to a micro level. Each one of these projects gets us closer to the goal of having fewer residents and businesses dealing with flooding, dealing with taking the carpeting and drywall and having to replace it, the resulting increase in your homeowner's insurance, et cetera. What we're trying to do is invest in our community and ramp it up appropriately because of all the different concerns that have been highlighted.
I was going to say something similar. This graph here on page 20, section 2, it says that we're going to get to the recommended level of service by 2028. So we are taking a very long time to get there. We know what our needs are, but we're trying to be sensitive and think about what people can pay, as Mr. Waldeck said. You made the example about your roof. If you didn't fix your roof, which we haven't fixed things that we should have done, as Commissioner Burnett was saying, it's most likely going to result in increased costs to your house because you have to repair the floors or whatever. And when we're thinking about these increases to the stormwater utility fee, I think we also think about how, if we don't do projects, how it affects people who are in areas that are flooding. We had flooding in our basement, and it's not cheap when you have to repair drywall and replace carpet and replace furniture. So those are real costs to people that are affected by stormwater projects not happening as quick as they should be. So it's a balance. It's a delicate balance, and we're trying to get projects done without an a huge burden to our residents. But we do need to gradually get there because we don't have volunteer workforces to fix stormwater projects. They have to be funded somehow. So.
And it's a discussion every year. It's not just this year and we're done. These are not the numbers set until 2028. We have this conversation every year. It gives us the experience of what happened the year before, kind of going back to how we prioritize the projects, how the projects have worked, what's coming up on the horizon, and using it as part of our long-range plan. That's why it's in the long-range plan document here in our budget. the roof analogy is actually a really good one, and Becky hit it right on the head, that if you don't fix the roof, there's going to be all sorts of other problems that come up from it. And I think we can relate that pretty easily to stormwater. But as Bob said, and we've heard a couple of times, we aren't going to 100% fix this. And we do our best to, instead of having 3 feet of water in your basement, maybe it's 1 inch. I think that's something that I heard even in that April storm. I used to get, my whole basement would flood, and now I only had a little trickle in the one corner by the sump pit. Those are notable changes that have come from actual construction and in-the-ground projects. So if we want those projects to continue across the village, and if we want those projects to be maintained so they do work, we do have to find a way and find that balance to continue with the stormwater fee. And whether it's an increase or it's an estimated investment, I think those are all important things that we will have this conversation every year. And the fact that we have people here asking about it tonight, or this morning, I should say, is a positive for me. I think people are getting a little bit more interested in understanding what the stormwater utility is, how it works, and we want to hear from you, and you're exercising your right for that right now today, so thank you.
Other questions or comments, please?
Mayor?
Oh, I'm sorry, David.
I just wanted to note, since everyone chimed in, I think that I want to note 2 things. First is the issue that I hope we are going to be discussing shortly about the stormwater system and the issue presented by increases in impervious area. When a 1,200 square foot house is demolished and a 5,000 square foot house is in its place, and you have an increase in impervious area, an increase in runoff to nearby properties, especially when 3 houses are demolished across the street that's higher than your property, and then that water is moving towards your property. That's a big issue, and I think we need to address that. And when I think about this stormwater utility and what's been said here, and what's been said by this council, and we need to address it, and going from 3 foot to 1 inch, and those things, I think those are all noble goals. One of my biggest concerns is, we can go from $9, approximately $9 to $29 in, this 15-year period. But if we're not, if we're going to continue creating and adding to the problem, as we are reducing the problem in some areas, I think that that's doing a disservice to our residents. And so I look forward to addressing that very soon in ways that we can, because I think that's extremely important to our residents. The second thing I wanted to mention, and just not surprising, I'm still very concerned about this increase this year, and I think that there's a portion of this that needs to be about the ability of residents and the ability of our community to contribute at this level of increase to this stormwater utility. So that's an area I'm concerned about, and I'll just leave it at that. So thank you.
Just to follow.
Yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me, Mayor. Just to follow up on that point.
What you're about to do. Go ahead.
One of the village's high priority action items is to relook at our local stormwater code as to when and to what extent stormwater controls are required to be installed with additions or new housing starts. That item is actually scheduled for a public hearing in front of the Stormwater Floodplain Oversight Committee in their November meeting, and will make its way to the council probably December or January. The hope is to have any changes that we choose or not choose to make in place by next year's construction season.
And if I may translate that for a moment, what that means is that right now the village as a full waiver community enforces DuPage County's stormwater ordinance in terms of what stormwater controls need to be put in place on a variety of different projects, whether it's residential, commercial, whatever the case might be. What we're talking about is, and we have the ability to do this as a home rule community, does Downers Grove want to be more restrictive than what DuPage County currently requires or allows? And that's what the manager's talking about. We're going to have a conversation about that because it has been pointed out by a number of people in the council that should we be doing more to try to minimize the stormwater issues from their outset, in addition to trying to fix them as they are identified. I mean, we have one challenge of being a community that was founded in 1832, so there are a lot of things that were built in places that you probably wouldn't build them today, but that's where Pierce Downer got off his wagon and put his shovel in the ground, and so we are where we are. But it's a good point and worth looking at, and we will be looking at it in terms of, can we be more restrictive than what the county currently requires? And by the way, the county just redid their ordinance last year. So we were back to public comment. Yes, thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. Pastor Scott unfortunately had to leave for a meeting, but he did write something and signed it. Asked that I read it, and then I'll give you my comments, so
sure,
that's okay. Pastor Scott states we heard 4 council members on Tuesday stating their regret and concern about the placing of fees on not-for-profit churches and houses of worship. We have the opportunity during this budget to make that right. You said after a year under the belt, we've learned and that utilities placed on churches was a mistake, and this is a value judgment the village made, and he states, let's make it right. So that's Pastor Scott. My name is Mike Ryan. I'm the parish administrator. I live at 1927 Bending Oaks Court in Downers Grove. Been a resident for over 30 years. Over the last year and a half, churches have proven their economic value to the community. We had a report done by Partners for Sacred Places, specifically done on St. Mary's, and it placed a value of over $16 million in value it brings to the community. We believe that the long-term cost of the village will be much greater if we continue to be taxed. You're concerned about the will of the people. Back in June of 2013, we presented a petition to the council where we had 5 churches gather over 1,200 signatures. We are now 17 churches strong, and they're united, and they strongly urge you to exempt the churches. The legality of the fee has been overturned in various lawsuits, and it's not like we're asking you to recreate the wheel. The motto of Jacksonville, Florida, exempts the houses of worship and the churches. So we ask you to follow that, and we ask you to move forward, and highly recommend you exempt the churches and houses of worship. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. And on that point, today we're talking about the budget and allocating dollars. To your specific point, there is a motion, or actually a workshop item that's coming up. When do we expect it will be?
Either end of October or first meeting in November.
Thank you. That will specifically address that request to restructure the stormwater utility to exclude either all tax-exempt parcels or tax-exempt parcels that, for lack of a better word, host religious organizations. Houses of worship. I like that term better.
Thank you. Reverend Dan Martinson, I'm the pastor of Hobson Road Community Church. We've been a church in Downers Grove for over 60 years. I want to thank you just for the ongoing conversation that you've had, and I'm sure you understand or know where this is going. My question / comment would be about the analogy that we've used several times this morning regarding the homeowner with the leaky roof, which I think is a pretty fair metaphor for the situation. If I'm understanding the council correctly, what I'm hearing is that the need for stormwater utility fees in their current incarnation is based, at least in part, perhaps in large part, by either the failure or the neglect of the village government in years past, perhaps in decades past, to properly zone, to properly take care of situations, maintenance, so on and so forth, as the need arised. Perhaps, we know hindsight 2020. We know better than they did in years past, not to place the blame there. If I'm understanding that right, my question is, if we were to use the analog of I'm a homeowner and I have a leaky roof, I believe one of the councilmen said almost precisely this: if I failed to maintain my home for 30 or 40 years, or whatever the case might be, I would then be looking at an emergent situation wherein I had repairs that needed to be made, and as we've all said, the money needs to come from somewhere. Where that analogy breaks down, given the current fee structure, is that it would not be an option for me to levy a fee for my neighbors and say, you guys have to now fix my roof. And I feel that in part, that is what this council has done by choosing to collect these fees from not-for-profit institutions, specifically houses of worship, that would not have been responsible for these fees had they been collected in the timely manner that perhaps they should have been. Do you follow my analogy?
Yes.
In other words, we're now,
wouldn't have
as
paid for them
houses, had they been collected in the first place, they would have not have been doubly levied against people of faith in this community. And so the current situation, our concern about the way they're being levied is that we have people of faith in Downers Grove who pay the burden as a private homeowner and then go and pay it a second time as a person of faith in a manner that would not have happened had they been collected in the first place. I appreciate any comments or feedback on that.
I think we understood your point. Yeah, and just to add to the comment that Commissioner Barnett made about whether things were maintained in terms of stormwater at the level that today we think that they should have been. And again, people can debate about that, but there's no question that it's not where it should be in the assessment of the current village council and recent village councils. I do want to throw in there, because I don't think we necessarily I don't think we're intending to throw everybody in the bus from 10 years ago, but the community makes different value judgments, and that changes sometimes over time. Right now, stormwater is a big deal. In the past, it was roads, and before that, it was something else. There was a period of time when the perceived value judgment of the community was not to raise property taxes for any reason, even if that meant not doing the maintenance. In fact, I remember one year where there was actually a rebate back to the community, which at the time everybody thought was a great idea. But if that meant not fixing the roof that year, maybe 10 years later, it's not such a good idea. And that's kind of what I think Commissioner Barnett is getting at, is there were perceptions back then as to what the community wanted, and that was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And then you can go back even farther than that, where I think there was a perception that we don't want to raise property taxes for any reason, even if it means streets, sidewalks, stormwater. We're just not going to do it. So it's, if you could take your car, for example, and decide, I know I should change my oil every 3 months, but I'm just not going to do it. Okay, that's a judgment you made. You saved yourself the $35 on the oil change, or if you do it yourself, maybe less. But eventually it catches up with you. And I think that's what Commissioner Barnett's getting at. But your point, I think we understood your point, is if had the property taxes been increased over the last, whatever, 30 years to get to that point, those would not have been levied against houses of worship. You're right.
Mayor, can I say something? I had two things a little bit off of the NFP component. One thing I want to do is just take an opportunity to soften a little bit my criticism. The mayor's right, certainly decisions were made about maintenance and should not do it. What is the impact on taxes? There also is a fairly substantial, again, welcome to the outside world affecting Downers Grove, the relationship to federal law that comes into play, such that the challenges, some of the biggest challenges in Downers Grove, roughly, Nan's going to correct me when I say this, but are roughly between about 39th Street and 59th Street. And one of the things you'll see if you go outside of those areas, either north of 39th or south of 59th, or if you go to some of the areas of perhaps southwest Naperville, there's been a decided recognition, dates back to about the mid-'70s, about appropriate management of stormwater under any kind of construction conditions. And so what Downers is faced with is not unlike what Clarendon Hills is faced with, not unlike LaGrange and Hinsdale. The areas developed prior to about the early to mid-'70s struggle from design concepts employed during those times, which were much different than are even allowed today. And so that is no small part of what we're trying to recover from. What do I think? In the 80s and 90s we should have been more acknowledgement of that from this body? Yeah, absolutely, I do. But there's some realities there too. Those development, the core of this town that was developed early on, just had different philosophies as allowed by law in how to deal with stormwater. So we are recovering, but some of it, not all of it, is neglect. The other thing I wanted to just ask, maybe if we could do that table on 20. I can't find it right this moment, but early on, we had that table that showed typical fee for a typical household. And I know it's just an extrapolation, and we can see the 3 times effect of this, but maybe we could include a line that showed the typicals in each of those years.
We'll do. We'll put that together for our next discussion, late October, early November.
Thanks.
Good morning.
Good morning. Tom LeCren, 545 Chicago Avenue. With respect to Dave Olson's comment on what are village practices that are causing stormwater problems, I think we need to review that. We did a building code change a few years ago. I think that what we allow is still affecting us, increasing the amount of stormwater runoff there is. Is there a plan, in fact, is there budget money for it in this year? Do we have a complete review of these things, or at least get started on it? If we don't, then we're back to, well, if you don't do it, then it's not going to get done, type of thing. So my question is there money in this year's budget, or 2015 budget, and what's the plan look like? The other half of the question is, yeah, we meet DuPage County stormwater requirements, but we're a home rule village. Why can't ours be more strict?
The answer to your question.
It can, and that's what we're looking at as a high priority action item, and we're doing that in 2015.
Yeah,
And what are we doing, or should we be doing anything to encourage people that if they want to expand their house, they just go up a level? In my neighborhood, there's at least 3 that are doing that. I think we should be encouraging that. In other words, they're not increasing their impervious area, but they're getting the space they require, rather than tearing it down, which is where's the scrap going? And therefore, they're not impacting the stormwater system. Thank you.
On page 29, John, or pardon me, Tom, of the tab 2, there's a description of the medium priority action report and where it stands, and that's for the stormwater management regulations.
So it is budgeted for this year, Tom, and it's actually just staff time. It's a rewrite of the ordinance for council consideration. That's up in front of the hearing body in November, and then onto the council in the following months. And there is some interplay between the threshold at which you have to provide on-site controls and then some of the zoning controls as well that accompany those. And that will all be on the table and has no budget impact in 14 or 15. It's just allocation of staff time.
Please.
Good morning. My name is Robert Mesh. I am 20 North Tower Road in Oak Brook. I'm not a resident of Downers, but I am a parishioner at St. Joseph's Parish and attended last Tuesday's evening. The analogy about repairing the roof, I think, is appropriate, but it might be framed in a different context. And I did some research about median income for families in the United States. I tried to dig up some data about median income in Downers Grove. The numbers vary. I was hoping that you may have more accurate data about residents of Downers Grove, what their median income was in 2008 versus median income now. All of the national statistics suggest that you're either maintained the same level of income or it's gone down in terms of median income. Median income is half of the people in that number have income below that, and half of the people in that poll have income above that. During the course of the past, well, since 2008, since the financial crisis, health insurance costs have gone up 16%. Cost of energy, gallon of gas was $1.78 a gallon in 2008. Now it's $3.70, $4. Cost of health care, cost of gas, cost of food inflation, and utilities have gone up. I think the analogy of repairing the roof is good in the context of this conversation, but as it stands for residents, we are being forced to make a decision as to whether or not we either A, repair the roof or not be able to live in the community. Because we have increased costs for all of these items that we are utilizing, but our incomes are not increasing. And so I would ask you to reflect on the needs of the community and also don't be afraid to put responsibility back on our shoulders. I mean, if you live in a flood zone and you want to put a furnished basement in, you're taking that risk as an individual homeowner. I mean, a lot of residents are looking to government to answer a lot of the questions, and it's our responsibility to decide. If we live in an area that's prone to flooding, we don't build something in the basement because there is a high risk of it being damaged. I would ask that you consider, this is very well thought through. I mean, I live in this community, but I grew up in this community, and so I still have a significant attachment to it. But we are getting to a point where the demographics of the residents in Downers Grove is changing, and with these increased costs that are a burden to us, we have to make a decision: are we going to repair the roof, or are we going to sell it? So, thank you very much.
Appreciate that, and that is something that's very much in the forefront of our minds, and goes back to those competing interests and striking that balance, because yes, it becomes more expensive to live in the community, but I think we also all know someone who, after the 2013 rain event, literally lost their home and was forced to move out of the community for that reason. And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, it's just another depiction of those competing interests. Both can result in an undesirable outcome, and that's why we have this conversation every single year, to try the best we can to strike that balance. Please.
I'll go quick, I promise. Jim Crawford, 201 6th Street. I just want to acknowledge there's 9 different churches here with very different people representation. I'll say my arguments for when we do the end of October. I just want to clarify it. I apologize for not knowing the city rules well enough. I believe the motion from Mr. Barnett, second by Mr. Durkin, was all nonprofits. You read back that you're going to do your 3-step criteria, and so the ordinance is all nonprofits. But I think we just clarified that you're going to do extra work beyond the ordinance and do look at just a structure that exists with exempting just religious house of worships as well. So there'll be 2 different outputs: one, all nonprofits, cost and impact of the structure, and then the additional work above the ordinance that'll be read out either the last meeting in October or the first one in November, will then a structure that just exempts the religious nonprofits. Am I correct in assuming that?
We'll present all that information, Jim, yes, to the council and community.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I feel kind of bad because I'm the guy that started this, but
Oh, no, you didn't.
You're
about 2.5 years behind schedule.
I have to tell you, I think this money's well spent. I just wanted to know the justification for it. You justified it, and I would agree that we need to do something.
Thank you. I'm glad we were able to answer your question. Welcome back, Mr. Waldeck.
Thank you again. Real quick, first off, if you're going to talk about the church eliminating waiving the churches, I still support waiving all the nonprofits. And the idea of the roof repair, let me expand on that a little bit. Yes, it's important to do the roof repair, but you got to have you do that to protect the people in the house. And so we have to protect the living arrangements in the house. You have family that needs food, clothing, education. So you have all those obligations going on inside, and if you can't take care of that, you really don't need a roof. So keep in mind the people. That's all.
Will do. Thank you.
This is a cause and effect and a maintenance issue as well. And where do I start? I live in Clyde Estates, and I've lived there for 27 years. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, development in the village. It's also one of the highest altitudes in the village. Last April, a year ago, my basement flooded, and my husband was out of the country, and I took care of it myself. I didn't call the village to complain. I didn't ask somebody to help me because it wasn't anybody else's responsibility but my own. With the roof issue, Mr. Neustadt, if my roof needs repair, which it has in the last twice since we've lived there, I didn't go to the village taxpayers and ask them to pay for the roof. We repaired it ourselves at our expense and our budget. We put it in our budget. We can't control nature. regardless of what Hollywood might tell us. Clyde Estates, the developer, I wish the developers today would develop like the Clyde Estates developer did over 60 years ago. 3 of the houses on my street do not have basements. We have a high water level where we live. We don't have storm sewers. The back easement of my property used to be a creek until they put the Y in, and they changed the configuration so there's no creek there anymore, just rocks. And so the water stays on my property when it rains, and I think we should take a look at how Elmhurst charges their residents. If water runs off your property, then you're taxed. The development issue, Mr. David Olson, thank you for mentioning that, because 10 years ago or so, we had a Brookbank, Bradley Brookbank development over off of Midaw and Brookbank, and the DuPage County put us on stormwater probation because of the development that we allowed to go in there. And the development continues here in the village just like it was then. Nothing's changed. We have three watersheds in Downers Grove. I live in the St. Joe's watershed, and the St. Joe's Creek goes across Webster. It comes over from Midaw and Brookbank and goes under Webster and Washington and Lyman, and all 3 of those streets have been impacted by southern and higher elevation developments that the village has allowed lots to be split. And these huge big mansions, most of them being spec houses, so no one's ordered that house to be put there. The house over on Lyman by 55th was one of the first ones to be put in, and the lot was empty and it was always filled with water. The Clyde Estates on the corner of Main and Clyde, we fought years ago when you split that lot, when you allowed that lot to be split. The water filled the front yard of that ranch house halfway whenever we had a big rain, and you still allowed it to be built with a lot split. So I don't understand why all of a sudden now, because we've had a few years of rain, about 10 years ago we had 5 years of drought. Maybe that was the years we had a rebate. So when we have droughts, are we going to get rebates? You know, we need to put a little bit of responsibility, like the gentleman mentioned, that when people develop their property because of private property rights, which I really feel strongly about, they should be allowed to do that. But then it's not the residents in the neighborhood and the town to solve their problems when their decisions impact their life. And we all have a limited amount of income. One of the issues maybe the council should consider going forward is the only manager in our village that's required to live in our village and to pay taxes to our village is our village manager. The rest of the village employees that impact our budget and determine how our budget is spent and how our money is, where it's siphoned off, is the village. The only person is the village manager that lives here, that pays into it.
Well, required to live here.
Yes.
Many
Required, not many. I just got the list.
Executes what we tell
There's
him.
about a dozen of our managers and administration that live here. The rest of them don't, and they're not required to.
Right, well, other communities don't even require the manager to live in town, so it's a...
My point is, we have limited income, just like the gentleman mentioned, and we are suffering from inflation. Not all of us can keep paying more and more from decisions that are being made at the village management level.
Mayor, can I interject briefly?
You can interject even unbriefly.
Thank you. I will try to keep it brief, though. We've heard a couple of times now the idea that if it's my roof that's leaking, I can't go to my neighbors and have them pay for it. Except that's where the analogy breaks down.
Same roof.
Yes, we're all under the same roof, exactly. The stormwater system belongs to all of us as a community. And so it's not a matter of the village or the village council going outside to bring in money. What we're doing is calling on everyone inside the house to help fix the roof.
Just let me touch on this idea of development. One of the things, government never moves as fast as one might wish, to be sure. But the idea that development has the potential to be a negative both to the stormwater system at large as well as to immediate neighbors is one that this council, plus Commissioner Durkin, who's not here, is well aware of, enough such that It was actually about a year and a half ago we started the discussion, and last year we determined we were going to try and do something about it this year, 2014. So I guess what I want to say is, nobody up here, you're not going to get any argument up here from anybody about whether or not new development is in fact have the potential to be a detriment, and whether or not this council and this local government ought to try and address that in some way, and we are. It's not a maybe in 2015 kind of an issue. It's happening starting in November. Do some of us wish it happened 2 years ago? You bet. But we're on it, and it's a well-known thing, and I think, frankly, we all agree on that aspect of it. So the stories of the past are likely accurate, at least to some degree, and your village government as it sits today and your council as it's sat now here for about 3 years is in agreement that those are probably not the best course of action forward. So we're trying very hard to address that, and we will be right now. So you'll see some changes, and it likely will have the effect of helping us, not hurting us, as we try and maintain and improve our stormwater systems.
Thanks. Other questions or comments? And then we'll have our 9:45 break.
Good evening, or no, it's afternoon. Maybe it's even morning. I'm Gordon Goodman. I live at 5834 Midaw, and there are two topics that I want to address today, and maybe I'll keep one after your break. But the discussion now of stormwater, I don't want to break into that. I think that's a very important one to continue. And I just wanted to make a couple of points about the way in which the village is trying to deal with its stormwater problem. It's important not just to put pipes in the ground and detention facilities that you construct. It's also important to preserve the floodways and the floodplains that exist now. There were remarks about people having subdivided and built on lots that were known to be flooded, vacant property. For a long time, since the 60s, the village has had proposals before it to acquire the lowlands. Barton and Ashman, in their original comprehensive plan for the village, developed this concept of conservation areas in the village to supplement the stormwater structures. These would be land that was owned by the public and used for water management purposes. At that time, there was a wonderful large area on the south side of Downers Grove where the Meadowbrook shopping area is now. And there are some long stories about what happened to those properties rather than being purchased by the public, and the development that went in there and how that happened. But that's, as we say, water over the dam or
under the bridge,
or
in the
backyard,
the
or basement,
backyards of the neighborhood.
Across the culvert. Yeah.
But there are still areas within Downers Grove that can be acquired for this water management purpose by the village, and I'm hoping that as the new concepts are developed for dealing with this, we look again at the Novotny report in the 60s, the Barton Ashman original comprehensive plan, and begin to do that kind of assembling of greenway networks in the village that can take the pressure off of the residential areas. In particular, I want to support the village's efforts to acquire properties that were improperly developed in the first place, up near the Grant and Lee Park. You've done some of that work. There are other opportunities in those neighborhoods that you were describing between 39th Street and 59th Street, where people have built in the wrong places over the past. If you look at that west branch of the St. Joe Creek that comes out of Patriots Park and goes to the west over toward the Hillcrest School, you'll see along that creek there are many properties that were developed in the creek bed. And there are now walls along at Canyon and Webster and all of those properties between Main Street and the Patriots Park. So those are practical places where you can spend money in a non-traditional way, getting back to the original principles that were enunciated by Barton Ashman and Novotny in their analysis of what the village should be doing to manage stormwater. And I'm glad that the current council is open-minded and already working with the staff to take that course of action. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think putting my oar in the water about the stormwater fee, I really believe that that is something that the community as a whole has to support, and not just the private parties. That it is important for institutions, whether they're institutions of education or of health care or of religious houses of worship, to support this effort as well. And if you're going to tinker with this in order to give relief to, say, the houses of worship, I would hope that you're going to look at the possibility of not exempting them, but giving them a fractional reduction, perhaps. But I think it's very important for all of the property owners in the community to support this according to their contributions of impervious space and runoff to the community. The last thing I wanted to remark is I think it's very good that you're going to look again at the zoning and subdivision control ordinances and their impact on the stormwater management of the community. That was what we said we would do when the when the major revision was made some, what was it, 10 years ago? We looked at the setbacks from the lot line. We looked at coverage. We looked at a lot of factors of the zoning for the first time in many years at that time. And we said we don't know in detail what the effect of these changes are going to be, but we'll look again at it in a, I don't know what the number that you picked out of the air, or the previous council had picked out of the air at that time, but it was certainly everybody's thought that after some experience with this revision, we would be looking at it again to see if it met the needs of the community, and I'm glad to see that that's, as I understand it, on the table again for this next period. So those are the remarks I'd like to make on this topic, and I would, at the appropriate time, like to also address your support for community efforts such as the Community Grants Commission used to be able to support, and the use of the hotel tax money, but I don't know when that would be appropriate.
That
Tuesday night.
Tuesday night. The item with that topic will be on the council agenda for action this Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's first reading, Mayor.
For first reading. Thank you. Hey, Mr. Falish, you're the last thing standing between us and the 9:45 break.
Yeah, Frank Baelish, 820 Prairie. You know, I live right across the street from Washington Park. You fellas put in about a $7 million project, and I think it'll, ever since it's been in, I've seen a couple occasions where there's maybe inches of water that are in there. So it seems to me that you're not spending your money too carefully.
Did you drive by the August 18th? I think kids were in boats in there.
Literally.
Yeah. The rainstorm we had in April of 2013, people were in boats in that park. Do you remember?
I don't remember.
Oh, I do.
Well, I didn't see them because I just saw inches of water in the park. And really, it's only, I think, it was 2 occasions.
Well, it's, on the occasions where it really counts, it did a job. It did a job. The boats were not in the basements. I'm going to suggest that we take our 9:45 break, even though it's 10:20. Let's try to keep it short so we can remain on schedule. See if we can back in 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
Something like that.
Between 5 and 10 minutes? All right, thank you. We modify after the fact. It's really convenient. We're going to move on to the next couple of topics, and obviously we're not adjourning at 10:30, but we'll try to move forward with the rest of the subjects and wrap up expeditiously. So back to your regularly scheduled program.
We're going to switch gears and talk to about a different kind of water now, our drinking water in our village. This can be found on section 4-24 in the budget book. The water fund is also an enterprise fund. Excuse me. And revenue is generated from the water bills all of our water customers received. The objectives of the water system are to provide safe and reliable drinking water and fire protection, to operate and maintain the water system in the most cost-effective manner, and to achieve stable and sufficient water rates to do that. In fiscal year 2015, we project revenues of $25.2 million and expenses of $19.38 million. The revenues include a $10 million planned bond issuance and a recommended rate increase of 14%. The DuPage Water Commission rate is slated to increase in 2015 by 17%. We purchase our water at the village here from the DuPage Water Commission, who in turn purchases water from the city of Chicago. As we mentioned earlier, as a condition of this arrangement, the village is not allowed to pump water from our wells or to mix well water with Lake Michigan water. Although we do maintain those wells for emergency purposes. If we were to stop receiving Lake Michigan water for some emergency reason, we do have the ability to use those wells in that situation.
I'm sorry, do you go back to that last slide? That last bullet point? I just want to just let that sink in for a second. All right, thank you.
This slide shows the proposed multi-year rate increases that were recommended by the water rate study that the village conducted in 2011. The rate study recommended these increases to provide revenue to pay for needed infrastructure replacement throughout the village. And this was put in place prior to these increases that we saw from the DuPage Water Commission, which are shown on the second line of this table. These were enacted by the Water Commission after the village's water rate study was conducted. This increase in the cost of purchasing water caused the village's water rates to be increased more than recommended by our water rate study plan. And those increases are shown on the last line of this table. Just wanted to show you a breakdown of where we're spending money in 2015 in our water fund. $9.08 million of this will be spent for the cost of water. O&M is $4.03 million. Debt service is $670,000. And capital costs are planned to be $5.6 million as we continue our ongoing program of replacing our aging infrastructure and maintaining our water storage facilities. The major capital expenditures in 2015 are for water main replacement, $2.3 million. We just had a first reading at council this week, and we'll be discussing that as well this coming week on the replacement of the meter transmission units at $2 million. And the rest of the items are for miscellaneous maintenance of our facilities and for tank rehab, as I said, and for some well rehabilitation. And that concludes the portion about water fund.
Questions from the council about the water fund?
That water system security enhancements, was that a mandate for our water system, or is that just something that we're doing to protect the assets in the system? If I'm recalling, there was some, I don't know if it was a federal or a state fence building protection of our
Homeland Security or something, wasn't it?
Homeland Security, something.
There
I
were-
guess then the second question is there any dollars and cents or grants that were able to come with that for those enhancements?
I believe we received some grants initially for that. Maybe Andy?
The first phase was done with grants, yeah.
Yes, it was mandated. Yes, we do security improvements for our own sake in addition to what's required as a minimum. And yes, we did receive some grants for the first phase.
Okay. Any more grant opportunities out there, we would always strongly suggest to look at it. And I think we have an excellent grant coordinator and can look for those opportunities. But that's one of those things that I think we could perhaps use that for.
Will do.
This is not so much about our system as it is a little broader question. Is there anybody that we're aware of, and if there is there any way we could be helpful to them, who's trying to plan for a, I don't know what it would take, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, alternative sourcing? Whether it comes from the river west or it comes from the lake north or in Indiana or something, that there might be down the road some additional opportunities for shopping, for lack of a better term, or water sources other than Chicago. The reason I ask is, obviously, we can't do it alone.
Yes.
But if there was anybody, we should be trying to help them. Chicago's financial problems are so radical that it's not, they're not going to do anything other than maximize what they can get out of the suburbs.
So, yes, there are a couple of agencies and groups of municipalities looking for alternatives to sourcing water from the city of Chicago. However, all of them are sourced from Lake Michigan, just going through different municipalities as the source. Some of them have to do with the concept of interconnecting existing systems. Some of them have to do with building new systems to connect to a different part of Lake Michigan. It's important to understand that all that is regulated by the same Great Lakes Water Commission. And some of that is the same whether you go through Chicago or not. It's also important to understand, as we look at that there are obligations and contractual obligations that municipalities have with DuPage Water Commission as far as how long we have to stick with the current system. And also that under those same contracts, what the city of Chicago cannot charge the municipalities more than they charge their own highest paying customer. So there are some checks and balances.
Yeah, that does.
That's correct.
Perfect. Well put.
So those are all the things at play, and yes, we've been monitoring a couple of south suburban communities that are looking for options, and we're working with them on information as well.
Yeah, and just to add to that, there are obviously this is a massive undertaking because of the infrastructure and the agreements and other things, but given the extraordinary cost increases and the feeling of no ability to control what's being dictated by the city of Chicago, notwithstanding the fact that it's an enormous undertaking, there is serious looks being taken at potential alternatives of any kind with respect to sourcing. There are a number of conferences of governments, DuPage Mayors and Managers, Northwest Municipal Conference, West Suburban Municipal Conference, I forget the one that's to the southwest of us, but all are looking at that because everybody's more or less in the same boat. At the same time, also working independently to try to, through Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus and IML, work with Chicago to try to, best you can, try to ameliorate some of the stuff that's being jammed down our throats, but also working with the county and the DuPage County Water Commission in particular to try to heighten in accountability, because there's a lot of things that are said by Chicago, oh, don't worry, and then we don't get to see transparency into why these, there's stated justifications for these increases.
Yeah, stated.
Stated justifications for the increases that nobody buys, and then when you say, show me, you find out that there's something different happening. So at least the DuPage County Water Commission has some very knowledgeable and experienced people, like John Spatz, for example, who are with Jim Zay, who's the chairman of the DuPage County Water Commission, are can all argue about whether it's enough or not, but at least are making attempts to put some pressure on Chicago to show that transparency, to try to keep them accountable. But the reality is, you don't have any control over them. And that's why there's serious looks being taken at trying to come up with some alternatives, but because you just can't sit here and take it over and over again. Because what you hear is that there's a $71 per household increase like that. The stormwater utility fee pales in comparison to that. So yes, there are ongoing, active, animated conversations that are happening at the municipal level, both individually and organizationally across the entire Chicago metropolitan area, because that is a very, very serious issue for all of us.
Is there any way to, within this may be a little more of a rabbit trail than you wanted this morning, but within the existing Water Commission contract structure as it relates to the municipal side, Mayor, it seems like maybe through DMMC and the Water Commission pursuing changes in those contracts might be the most appropriate first step to apply some back pressure to Chicago. If you were everybody knows the infrastructure challenge that's out there, and you can't just have all of a sudden a different pipe to the lake. But if we were allowed blending opportunities, it would start to push back a little bit on Chicago, because they wouldn't see sort of the never-ending revenue source that was out there. So
Yes.
I just encourage us to be pressing for that to whatever degree we can as municipality between mayors and managers and the Water Commission.
Absolutely.
I had asked the manager about this, but I was just hoping you could explain it a little bit for everyone, that this is the last year of the rate study increase, but there's a lot of unpredictability with the Water Commission because of the sales tax change.
Correct. We had a study done a couple of years ago that Nan just explained, and the last year of that study is 2015. We've already engaged the consultant to update our study. One of the main components of what we should charge is how much we pay for water. That is highly uncertain right now. There's a couple things. One, we just talked about the infrastructure challenges and funding challenges of the city of Chicago. The second thing is the restructuring of the revenue sources for DuPage Water Commission. Right now, a portion of their revenue is derived from sales tax. In 2016, the Water Commission will no longer be able to charge sales tax to cover their operating costs. So all of their revenue will come from the sale of water, and that will affect the rates going forward. We do not have a projected rate beyond this year from DuPage Water Commission yet. As soon as we have that, we will plug it into our study.
One of the other things, just as an aside, that we tried to do through the municipal organizations is to have a strong voice in who gets appointed to the DuPage County Water Commission. So we try to also make sure that our voices are heard in that respect as well. Other questions from the council on water? Any questions from the audience on water, the water fund?
Okay. The last of our three funds that cover our village infrastructure is our capital project fund. That's on page 4-28 in your book. And that's where we derive our revenues and expenses for streets, sidewalks, bicycle facilities, and other capital projects. Our goal system-wide is to use a systematic approach to maintain infrastructure at the most cost-effective level. And we've talked about this a number of years with our street system. That really carries over into all of our systems, to have a complete understanding of what our system is and the costs and benefits of spending money at different points in time. We also look to coordinate the timing of projects to minimize costs and inconvenience to residents and maximize project benefits. Again, I wanted to just show you a couple of highlights from this year's work. We're just wrapping up work, considerable street reconstruction, water, drainage improvements, traffic calming in the Downers Grove Estates and Esterbrook neighborhoods. That is south of 63rd Street and west of Main Street. Brook and Center, we just completed a major street reconstruction project in this area that's north of Butterfield and east of Finley. And we just completed about $4.5 million of street maintenance and resurfacing work this year throughout the village. We've also constructed about 1.5 miles of new public sidewalks, considerable sidewalk removal and replacement, and some accessibility improvements, including this one shown at McCollum Park down by 67th Street. Just a summary of projected revenues and expenditures in the Capital Projects Fund. We're looking to have a revenue of $8.37 million, expenses of $13.67 million. We are, in this fund as well, spending down bond proceeds from the 2002 $25 million bond issuance. And this fund is supported from multiple sources, including home rule sales tax, property tax, local gasoline tax, and the telecom tax.
Just to interject, I answered Bill Waldak's question about where is the transportation tax that was enacted, local gasoline tax used. I misspoke. It's not in the facilities area. Since 2012, that local gasoline tax has been funding road resurfacing and is in this fund.
Just go back to that last slide just for a quick second. I fully appreciate the second bullet point there explains the difference between the 8.3 and the 13.6. But since the top part just sort of jumps out at people, maybe we would suggest going forward we would have another row underneath that one that would just shows that we have revenues, but then there's bond proceeds that are being spent down so that the two at first blush balance out. Because if someone just looks at that, they think, oh my goodness, you're spending twice what you're bringing in. What the heck are you people doing? If you don't get down to the second bullet point, you might miss that.
I mentioned the $25 million bond issuance, and this is just a summary. Since 2012, we have been aggressively reconstructing streets throughout the village. In 2015, we are planning work in Clyde Estates subdivision, Barneswood area, or in Orchard Brook at Lacey Creek, and a couple of smaller segments of Brookbank Road, Lacey, and Maple Avenue east of Fairview Avenue. Of that $25 million, after 2015, we'll have a very small amount left that could be available for other small projects or as, depending on how our bids come out in this year as well. But we are well on our way to spending that $25 million bond issuance and have addressed many streets throughout the village. In 2010, we did a pavement condition rating throughout the village, and we found that 22% of our streets were in a condition that was not maintainable. And what I mean by that is they couldn't be fixed by milling them and resurfacing them. That's where we came up with the list of projects to be reconstructed. And at that time, we set a goal that by the end of 2015, we did the bond issuance, we did the street reconstructions, and our goal was by the end of 2015, we were going to be in a position where 1% of our streets were in that unmaintainable condition, or 99% of our streets were in a maintainable condition. I'm happy to report today that we will achieve that goal by the end of 2015 when we complete the list of reconstructions this year. What that means is, I know you've seen these pictures before, is we showed, this is what the streets look like in a pavement condition where they are maintainable. We're able to keep them in that condition we all like to see. We're able to, when they get into the lower regions of these conditions, we're able to mill them and resurface them at a much more cost-effective maintenance, the $1 to $4 ratio. That's where we're able to maintain these streets. So what I'm saying is that by the end of 2015, 99% of all streets in the village will be in this maintainable condition. And what you won't see is what we showed you in prior years where we had this category of streets where we originally had 22% of our streets throughout the village in this condition. You will not see that.
It's terrific.
That's a huge success story that has worked through not only our budgeting but our long-range planning and high-priority action items and all the things that are in this book that have won awards, and we've done so well as this council and previous councils to get to this point. So congratulations to everybody, both at this table and in the staff world, that have helped us get to that point. It's fantastic.
And adding on to that, we're in a position to continue to maintain them so that things like that don't happen again.
Right.
Just like to give you just an overview of the projects planned for 2015. We have about $4.4 million planned for street maintenance. We have, in addition to the neighborhood streets we're doing, we're also going to be addressing Fairview Avenue from 55th Street to 75th Street, and we will be receiving some grant money to assist us with that as well. We have, as I mentioned earlier, the reconstruction projects, and they add up to $5.1 million. That's our street portion of this fund for 2015. The other projects planned for 2015 out of the Capital Projects Fund include sidewalk work, which is shown here highlighted. That's $761,000, and it's a combination of maintenance of our existing system, new sidewalks, accessibility improvements, and Ogden Avenue land acquisition for our Ogden Avenue sidewalk project. We also include here funding for the 31st Street bike path. That's our contribution to DuPage County. Pavement striping, neighborhood traffic studies, gateway sign replacements, and EAB eradication. The EAB eradication was created this year as a capital project because we identified that over the next 6 years we need to spend a little bit over $1.5 million to remove ash trees that will not survive despite the treatment that we're doing, and to replace them, as well as to continue to treat the trees that are responding to treatment. This is a 6-year time frame to complete the cycle, and that is why this was created as a capital project, because it's a 6-year time frame. It's about $1.5 million, and we need to address this. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions? More questions on streets? Other capital projects?
Dan? How effective has the EAB treatment been?
It's been effective for the younger trees, and it's been effective for trees that aren't as harsher conditions where they're able to get more nutrition and water. It's been difficult for trees that are in confined spaces, some of the older trees, trees that are already maybe under stress. What we really notice is that with the harsh winter we had and the drought the year before, it really accelerated some of that stress that the trees were experiencing. And I might add that there's a separate memo in the manager's report, or in the executive summary of the budget, that's specifically about this issue.
Emerald ash borer, yes. Thank you. Questions from the audience on streets or trees or other capital projects?
Hi, I'm Gordon Goodman, and I had a couple specific questions about streets, and the first one regards Jefferson. It's a dead-end street, a cul-de-sac ending on the east, and the section that runs from Dunham to that cul-de-sac is, well, particularly the section between Dunham and Middaugh falls apart regularly after it's been resurfaced. It's currently in a very bad state, but it didn't seem to be one of the reconstruction streets that you had mentioned. We've been speculating as we drive over that it is a street that wasn't properly installed in the first place, and that's why no matter what patching is done on that street, a year or so later, it's in bad condition again. So I wanted to ask you to look at the possibility of reconstructing Jefferson, at least the portion between Dunham and Middaugh. And there's also the complication that the Nelson homestead property is now again being actively investigated for, maybe you've already seen plans for the subdivision to be partially completed or entirely completed just north of Jefferson and between Brookbank and Carpenter. And as that work is done, there's a great deal of issue about where the construction traffic is going to enter and what damage is going to be done to the surrounding streets by that construction traffic. And again, that's an issue that I don't see any attention to, but there must be something in your proposed or actual agreement with the developer about that responsibility for reconstructing damaged streets. And so I'm not really sure the sequence of operations that you want to have here, but I'm just saying that that area of an established neighborhood is going to need a lot of attention. And we hope that maybe you can deal with the section of Jefferson between Dunham and Raw in a more timely fashion.
We'd be happy to take a look at that.
The other question I had is, in that same general area, it does say that you're going to be working on the reconstruction of Brookbank between 59th and 60th Street. And that was a problem for some time because of the level of that street and the flooding associated with the Bradley development that we've talked about earlier in the meeting. So I'd like to know, how have you resolved that issue, and what do you plan to do about reconstructing that street?
We plan to reconstruct the existing segment of Brookbank adjacent to the subdivision you just spoke of, and construct the missing leg from scratch, so it'll be a complete road system in there. The issue that put that project on delay was a question of the storage capacity in the adjacent detention and stormwater management basin as part of the Bradley Brookbank subdivision. A couple of years ago, as part of a review, we determined with the county engineers that there's sufficient storage in that basin to allow the construction of the new segment of the street in a manner that meets all county and local codes. So in short, we're confident that the construction of the new segment, which is missing now, and the reconstruction of the existing segment is compliant with village code, county code, and will proceed in 2015.
May I ask if you've also looked at the impact of any changes that you were thinking of adopting under your home rule for a stricter code than the current county code, and whether that would still be something that would be suitable under the current development plans. We've talked a lot about trying to make sure that we're not going to create new problems, and that's why you're looking at this ability of the village to look at a stronger code under its home rule authority. And I'm saying that maybe you want to be very careful in this neighborhood, because one of the main considerations and reasons that the village was put on probation was the neighbors came in and said, this is going to impact me very badly. They brought their case to the county, and the county looked at it. But those neighbors still are quite concerned about the impact of that development on the subdivision that is east of Brookbank. And so I'm hoping that as you look at this possible reconstruction of Brookbank, you're looking at the expected impact on the properties in the east subdivision.
We heard those concerns to such an extent that not only did we re-look at it in-house, we hired a third party to look at it and then asked the county engineers to look at it as well. All three parties concluded that the street can be reconstructed and constructed as described with no negative impact regarding stormwater. So yes, we heard those concerns and re-looked at it 3 times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom LeCranigan, 545 Chicago Avenue. I just have a question which is kind of self-serving, but is the resurfacing of Chicago Avenue from Main to Fairview on this year's budget?
I couldn't tell you. We come up with our list of streets in the spring. We have a 5-year street plan, but each year we relook at all of those streets again to make sure we're addressing those that need it the most. So we will be presenting council with a list of streets when we next spring when we bring our first contracts before them.
Okay, but I ask you to please either reconstruct or resurface. I don't think, because I live there, would have, but your plan was to resurface that with crumbling curbs and holes where we've gone patch on patch on patch, and it's still got a dip in it. I'd ask you to consider reconstructing that street so that it's self-serving again. But if you reconstruct it, then I can connect my sump pump instead of directly to the stormwater thing.
Well, we may not let you do that, but it very well could be on the list. We just don't have a final list until next spring.
Thank you.
Eventually, the ulterior mode of surfaces. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm back. I live in Clyde Estates, and the last time that Clyde Estates was paved was before we moved there 28 years ago. And I know David Fieldman mentioned when we were speaking about maintenance issues, how long one should wait before they repave, because the cost of repaving is exorbitant the longer you wait. So I question why, priority-wise, the village has not chosen to maintain roads in their 5-year plans or whatever, because it's almost been 6 times 5 years since it was paved in the first place. And when I see other roads being paved a lot shorter time period, I question why my tax dollars are not going to maintain roadways as they should be to minimize the cost to the taxpayers. And I also see roads being paved, and then shortly thereafter, I see cracks running down and sinkholes. And I've mentioned this to Public Works with no response from them, because I question the oversight being used and the contractors that we use, and why we're not holding them accountable for less than excellent, high quality, which Downers Grove deserves. And one example is Lyman Avenue, which runs from 59th to 55th Street and all the way down to Maple. And every time a house goes up or a tear down happens, we have another dip in the road, and it just is a real big sinkhole the whole way, and that's not on your list either. And why aren't we holding these contractors and these builders responsible for the cave-ins of our roadways that all of us then suffer car damage from? Going on to Brookbank, the developer was supposed to put that roadway in, so I question why now the taxpayers are going to be responsible for putting that second lane in that now we're going to be paying for. And that retention pond that's at Bradley Brookbank Development was supposed to be dry, and it hasn't been dry since the development was built. So is that approval that you've gotten from three different appraisers or whoever you've contracted with to give approval, the county and everyone else, is that going to remain dry when this roadway goes in? That's at pretty low there where St. Joe's Creek runs through, so I just question that as well.
Several comments there. The prioritization of streets was looked at in 2010 when we did the condition report, and what we found was what Commissioner Barnett and Mayor Tully were talking about. After years of lack of proper investment in maintenance activities, we had to prioritize the use of limited funds. And what we did was we identified the streets and put them in 2 categories: maintainable and not maintainable. And those were the pictures we put up. We took all the ones that were in not maintainable condition, identified them for reconstruction, and issued $25 million worth of bonds to facilitate the reconstruction over a 3 to 4 year period. At that same time, we made sure we had enough maintenance money invested in the streets that were in maintainable condition to keep them in maintainable condition. So what that means is some of the streets that are in really, really bad shape were not being worked on because we'd already slated them for reconstruction. We took streets that looked in pretty okay condition and maintained them to make sure they didn't fall into a level that would require reconstruction that would cause them to be 4 to 5 times more expensive. That can be very confusing to the untrained eye, because what you see is, hey, that street looks pretty good. Why are they working on that street? This street has fallen apart. Why aren't they working on that street? And that answers the question. To be most cost effective, we had to keep the streets that were in pretty good condition in good condition and maintain them, and then go back and reconstruct the ones that had fallen into disrepair. At the end of 2015, all but 1% of our street segments will be in maintainable condition, and we will have achieved that goal. Regarding curb cuts or cuts into new streets, one of the issues we're dealing with there is an intergovernmental issue where the sanitary district requires the replacement of a sanitary sewer service when a new house goes in or a significant addition goes in, which causes the street to be open cut and replaced. The village will work with the sanitary district to see if they will look at changing their requirement so that that sanitary sewer service gets assessed and a determination is made based on its condition whether it has to be replaced just because a new house is being built. If we are successful in doing that, the number of cuts into a newly paved or surface street will be minimized. That is on our agenda, and we have talked to the sanitary district about their requirement and how it affects the village as a whole and the cost of maintaining streets. And finally, regarding Bradley Brookbank, we have looked at the functionality of that basin. Regardless of whether it's wet or dry, it does function as required under county and local rules, and I think it will continue to function that way, and that's what we looked at. So the answer is it will maintain in that condition, and that condition is acceptable for the construction of the street.
And who's responsible for maintaining that retention pond, which was supposed to be the responsibility of the owner of the property, which is still the developer?
The developer.
And it's not being maintained. So is the village doing anything about that?
That's a whole different topic, Mayor. If we want to go offline and talk about all those details, we're happy to answer those, but they're well beyond the scope of
That
this
is a
budget.
stormwater issue,
Yes, it is, and yes, we're on top of it.
10 years
There
after
are-
it was put in.
Well, there are complications, as you know.
Well,
External factors that we
the
have to
cuts that go into the streets have been a problem for years, and we're just now addressing that. And another suggestion I'd like to make is when you put asphalt in, that tends to be softer and it sinks, whereas I can show you one right on Washington by Randall that's concrete and that's stiff as a board, and it has stayed that way since it was put in a few years back. I don't understand why we can't require concrete rather than asphalt to be used to minimize the further demise of the temporary whatever they put in there. If that's something that maybe could be considered, since we have control over those things, do we not?
We'll consider additional ways to minimize the impact on the road system from those cuts.
This is all part of the infrastructure costs that the taxpayers are paying for.
Well, obviously, we don't want to undermine the investment that we just put into a street.
And then my last issue is sidewalks. I question why we are putting sidewalks before some of the road maintenance that we're doing, and what we're getting from that. If we are we're putting sidewalks into dead ends, which doesn't seem to make a lot of common sense to me. And then some of the salt usage that we're using on the roadways then is deteriorating the roadways. We're putting salt trucks go down my road when we have snow predicted, and it's not doing any good, because then the snow if it does fall, then it melts and freezes into ice. So the salt usage that we are putting down is really detrimental to our infrastructure as well.
Thank you for your comments. When are we next going to talk about the snow plan?
We haven't had anything scheduled. We made significant changes to our snow plan, including salt usage, which has gone down. Its effectiveness has gone up. The cost has gone down. There's so many things that have changed. We did write a report on it that's available on our website that captures all of those things.
Right, and I know that regardless of that, we nevertheless, usually as a matter of practice, will touch upon it prior to the snow season, just as a reminder, everyone, is what the snow plan is.
We'd be happy to do that.
It's a great idea.
Thank you. Welcome back.
Again, yes, if you have a moment, I'd like to address a couple of other issues related to the capital fund. I'm pleased to see you're moving forward with the sidewalk program, and I was hoping to get a clarification. There was some discussion a while ago about sidewalks in Denburn Woods, and I support the current arrangement in Denburn Woods. I don't think there is a need for the full application of the village's policy for sidewalks on at least one side of every street in the village in Denburn Woods. I wondered, is that still under discussion? Has the village allowed for certain exceptions, such as Denburn Woods, to that policy?
That item is up for discussion as a medium priority action item between now and next April. So yes, it will be discussed, and yes, answers will be provided as to whether the sidewalk new construction plan extends into Denburn Woods and Johnson Woods, or if other modifications to the future sidewalk plan are to be made. So yes, within the next couple of months, that will be a policy discussion.
And so, just to put my R in early, I support making exceptions for exceptional neighborhoods. The second question deals with the trees. I'm very pleased to see that you have an active item here in the capital fund to deal with the emerald ash borer, and that it includes not only the removal but also the replacement of those village trees that are emerald ash borer impacted. Will there be other tree planting funds in the village budget besides this particular one directed at the emerald ash problem? And
Yes.
where will they appear?
We still have that in our operating budget, our normal budget, where we include tree removal and tree planting.
For the other parkway trees?
We just pulled this out about the emerald ash borer, about the ash
And this is to
trees.
supplement that, you're going to continue the level of spending that you've found necessary for the other parkway trees?
Yes.
In parallel with this? Very good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Morning.
How you doing? I'm Andy Crack. I'm at 1008 61st Street in Downers Grove. I had a question regarding this $31 million bond thing that you're going to be issuing for the construction of a new village facility.
That'll be
Actually, that would be a good segue. If there were no other further questions on any of the other things, that's the next topic.
Okay. Well, is there any reason why this isn't going to go out for referendum? I understand we're under home rule and that sort of thing.
Well, that's actually another topic that we're going to be discussing at the request of Commissioner Olson on Tuesday night. There are a lot of reasons why.
Okay.
For example, we just talked about some very large street investment projects. We don't go out for referendum for those either.
Okay.
Stormwater projects, when we bond out to fix streets, we don't go out for referendum for that
I
either.
understand by reading this, you're going to take that money that's going to be used for bonds that are retiring and slide that into this.
That's one
this
possible
debt service.
funding source for the project to try to get to a point where it would have a zero net impact upon the taxpayers.
All right, thank you.
But yes, that's actually the next topic we're about to go to, so we'll see you back then. Hello again.
Frank Falish, 820 Prairie. You know, I'm confused. This Brookbank deal, the original parcel was approved for 5 houses. Then the developer came up with, added a 6th house, 6th property, and then the village rejected his claims, and then the developer sued the village. Now, and I hadn't heard of any settlement that came about through that suit.
It's an ongoing matter.
Oh, it's still going on? It's been a couple of years. Okay, now.
Welcome to my world.
But now I understand they're going to have to raise the pavement. Is that correct?
The pavement of the new street will be constructed at the level required to make sure that it is clear of flooding under the
6
county
inches, right?
Correct.
And that was the county that put that through, I think, wasn't it?
County and the village, same set of codes.
Okay, but now, you know, when they raise that, it's going to affect the amount of storage in that area.
Correct.
And I don't know how we had all these differences, and now all of a sudden we're going to solve the problem.
That issue has been resolved through a collaboration of the county and the village and oversight by a third party.
Yeah, it seems to me it's kind of strange that it went through all of those machinations to come up with this final approval.
You're correct. It's been kind of strange, and we're confident with the answer.
Anything else before we move to facilities? Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to just jump back to the sidewalk issue. I'm not understanding why we're moving forward with more impervious surface. We're all being charged. This is increasing, as we've already talked about. We've put sidewalks on dead-end streets for no reason. No one shovels them in the winter. I'm in the street anyway. I'm not getting it. Why are you moving forward with more? People don't want them. Can't you backtrack? I realize it's in the big vision, but visions can be altered. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you. That's why when we get to the end of the sidewalk program, we are looking at what the remaining pieces are. That is coming up for discussion. All right, thank you. Well, then let's go to facilities. Please.
Thank you, Mayor.
And we're right on track to adjourn at 10:30.
Covered more subjects than last year.
Well, I'll add to that. A lot more public comment this year. Thank you. We've been asking for it for decades, and so thank you very much for coming out.
You can see on the agenda, let me step back. I'm Mike Baker again. I'm the Deputy Village Manager. I'll introduce and briefly present this section and then turn it over for discussion and questions. We titled this section of the morning discussion, Facilities, TIFs, and Other Funds. And it really represents an opportunity to talk about any of the funds that remain in the budget that haven't been discussed at this point. And you can see the list on the screen right here and the page reference for all of those funds beginning on page 4-32. However, we know that I think the primary desire, one of the most significant items for discussion is the high priority action item related to facility planning. And so I now want to specifically call reference to the funds that include expenses in fiscal year 2015 for the facility project. And those include the Major Buildings Fund, the Ogden Avenue TIF Fund, and the Asset Forfeiture Fund. In just a moment, I'll explain how much is budgeted in each of those funds and what the intended use or purpose is. But for those that may not be familiar, I want to step back for a second and provide a little bit of an overview on the facility project status and where we are right now. This has been something that's received quite a bit of attention, and there has been a lot of discussion about it. There actually is a memo that was included in the budget document. It immediately follows page 1-13 that describes in greater detail the facilities project plan that is being pursued at this time. A very brief synopsis is that the existing Civic Center facilities, we're talking primarily about the police station and Village Hall, are outdated and require substantial improvements. And so the question really that's been asked is, doesn't it make sense to explore all of our available options before taking steps that include significant maintenance costs for those buildings? So here we're actually talking about the literal roof, windows, improvements to the area outside of the buildings, ADA requirements, asbestos remediation. There are challenges that you have with buildings of that age that no longer meet the operational needs of the village. We've had an extensive amount of public discussion already and put a lot of information on the village website to help inform and educate residents. That began in earnest in February of this year, but really there was some discussion prior years, and the high priority action item was identified by council in 2013. The council direction is to pursue a two-phased approach that maximizes long-term community value. The first phase involves the construction of a combined public safety facility at the vacant property located at Ogden Avenue and Lacey Road. That combined facility would include a relocated police station and a relocated Fire Station 1, which is currently located in the Ellsworth Business Park. We've looked at how that would affect us operationally and determined that the village is better served by having a station in that location as opposed to constructing a new station in the northwest portion of the village, which we know is a known need. But I'm not going to get into a lot more details. Really, this was, again, just intended to provide a brief overview. The second phase of the project, then, once the police station relocates off of Village Hall and the fleet maintenance facility is removed from that site, is to take that over 8-acre parcel of property and really begin to ask some questions about what is the highest and best use for that property that right now is entirely owned by the village and generating no property taxes on that piece of property. And we think at this point the phase 2 recommendation includes construction of a village hall on a small portion of that site, but then the development of a multifamily residential property on the balance and really the majority of that civic center site. A lot of this information that I just briefly touched on is explained in much greater detail on the website and in information that has been provided previously. And there is, again, here's a page that demonstrates some of the information that you see on the website. Turning back again to the fiscal year 2015 budget, the 3 funds that I mentioned earlier that contain expenses for this project are the Major Buildings Fund with $150,000 that's earmarked and identified for professional services necessary to undertake the next steps of the project. The Ogden Avenue TIF Fund includes the use of available fund balance that has accumulated in that fund for the purpose of acquiring the property at Ogden and Lacey and doing the necessary site improvements, environmental remediation, installation of a traffic signal, other improvements necessary for that site that have nothing to do with the actual building construction. And then the Asset Forfeiture Fund includes a budgeted amount of $1.5 million, which would predominantly go for the actual design, architectural and other design and professional services for that particular facility. And there are very strict and restrictions on how this money can be used, and we're being very careful to make sure that we comply with those Department of Justice requirements. That number totals just over $6 million, and that represents the summary of how the fiscal year 2015 budget includes funding for this project. But again, this is an opportunity to talk about facilities as well as any of the other funds that you see referenced here. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
That sorry.
Go ahead, Joe.
That $6 million is not really any new money. Those are all dollars that we have on hand.
Correct. This is available dollars that we have identified in those funds for 2015.
And the Ogden Avenue TIF Fund expenditure would be used for, as you say, site development, environmental issues, and a traffic signal that otherwise would have been spent out of the Ogden Avenue TIF Fund for general development of that site, regardless of who the user is.
That's, yes.
Potentially.
Thank you, Mike, and I just want to clarify something, that we're having this conversation today as part of the budget conversation in terms of if this project happens, where it would impact the fiscal 2015 budget. The actual steps to make it happen will be coming up a little bit later when we start getting into contracts with a professional development firm and so on and so forth, and based on the project schedule that's included in the memorandum at the front of the budget document, there's an estimated timetable for when some of those things will happen. So there'll be other opportunities where things are being coming up on the village agenda for discussion and action. Today, we're really looking at the budget in terms of what do we have to reflect for this project if it is done in fiscal 2015. But the execution of the agreements and other steps necessary to start spending those funds, we start talking about a little bit later than today.
That's correct, Mayor. This is only setting a maximum expense amount, but in no way commits the council or the village to any of the next step activities that would be required.
Right, but one of the questions that we've been getting from folks as we've had this conversation over the past many months as well, can you give us more details? In order to do that, we have to start plugging things into the budget based on what we reasonably expect the case to be for this project and the many different pieces that are involved. So now we're starting to get down to some of that detail. So today we're looking at what would the budget look like given this current plan with respect to solving our many facilities challenges. So with that.
Just to the point of, this is setting the maximum, thinking specifically about the Ogden Avenue TIF and the expenses that would be used, the 4.38 million here doesn't reflect necessarily the grant opportunities that are out there and other low or no-cost loan opportunities, right?
Correct. We have evaluated we've looked at a range of alternative sources of funding for this project, one of which are funds that we know are available through the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency to assist with the remediation costs. Yeah, you're right. You do not see those reflected here in these numbers.
Well, I think it'll come to no surprise to anyone watching this process that I am not real thrilled about this expenditure on this list. I don't wish to take extra time to extend this meeting any longer. I know we've been here for quite some time this morning, but did want to make 2 points. First, on the Ogden Avenue TIF fund, I don't support spending Ogden Avenue TIF fund money in this manner. I do believe, as Commissioner Neustadt pointed out, that this type of money, this money from this TIF fund, would be used for environmental cleanup and perhaps traffic signal. And I support that type of activity, but I think my own judgment and my impression of TIFs and my support of TIFs is for commercial development. And I think that the restoration of this site and the installation of a traffic signal are great ideas, but I wish we could see commercial development happening rather amongst the entire site, or at least a much greater portion of the entire site than what's been proposed. So that's one thing that I've been concerned about since this first came up. These first ideas were presented, and I've discussed that at length. So just wanted to reiterate that point. And second, I've stated and will bring up again on Tuesday under new business that I support engaging and listening to the opinion of the people of Downers Grove through a referendum, and thus would want to hold off on anything until after we've engaged people in that way and hold off of any sort of expenditures in this.
And we will be discussing that very topic on Tuesday.
So as such, I don't wish to discuss it.
Particularly the challenge about engaging the community and maybe superior ways to do that haven't been discussed to date.
There is a commercial component to this project as well. It's not just an entire facility. Well, our guests may not. So, I mean, the frontage on Ogden Avenue is contemplated to have a strip mall setting and then even another outlet for perhaps a small fast food or coffee shop or something, restaurant. So, there is, TIF increment benefits from the commercial side here too. So, it's actually a very creative and innovative way to use this parcel that's been available for a very long time, and commercial outlets have not wanted to come there for many different reasons. So if we were planning, I'm going to look over to the planner. This is kind of a planner's dream to have commercial use, a municipal use, or a manufacturing type use, and then getting into the residential use. And I'm seeing heads nod. So, if we were to rebuild our community one block at a time, this might be kind of a good parcel to look at for how that might go if we were, say, out in Oswego, where some of the new development happened up there over the population increase. So I think it is an appropriate expenditure on Ogden Avenue to use those dollars for this site.
What's interesting about this process, where the budgeting process deviates from the planning process for facilities, is that whether you as a council member think that the Ogden TIF money should be used for redevelopment purposes for private redevelopment only, or whether you support it for public uses as well, it shows up in the same line item and the same bottom line in the Ogden TIF. So a vote yes or no on the Ogden TIF fund doesn't obligate your support or lack thereof for use for public. So it's interesting that whether you think it should or shouldn't be used here, it's likely that the outcome of the Ogden TIF budget will remain the same because it only sets maximums by categories.
Bob.
No, go ahead. I just want to talk about for the record, my thoughts on the TIF expenditure, and Dave, I certainly understand what you're talking about. I have no quarrel whatsoever with the appropriateness of using that money here. I think it's, there's obviously the technical merit, which has been studied in detail by our team. My only comment would be that there are some challenges that we face collectively with TIFs. Downers Grove's history with TIFs is mixed in terms of their effectiveness, and therefore the public opinion of them is mixed as well. And so, from where I sit, given the last bond refi was something under 3%, having that money remain in the TIF fund for two reasons. One, sort of future cash flow flexibility, because it becomes, if you were to bond that money instead, finance that money instead of draw that money, if you will, you maintain a couple of things. One is the future flexibility of the cash on hand as it relates to development along Ogden Avenue and just pulling it in smaller chunks here and there. And the other thing is, we struggle all the time, and with sort of getting broad-based public understanding of details of what we do. It's a challenge. Whether we do a referendum or don't do a referendum, we spent $25 million on streets 4 years ago, and half the town still thinks we're not fixing our streets right. And so, as it relates to TIFs, the TIF tool, irrespective of downtown Downers Grove or Ogden Avenue, the TIF tool is one which I really wanted to whatever degree we can, preserve the public's faith in the process of a TIF. And we haven't done anything wrong. I don't mean to suggest that, only that the communicational challenge down the road is tough. And so what I'd like to avoid is a scenario where somebody's standing over his back fence talking to his neighbors, and can you believe they took that money that they took away from the schools and bought a new building with it? That's not what we're doing, and I know that. But communicating that is so difficult that for me, the cost of money, the cost of financing right now is so small, and that challenge is so large, that I would like us to seriously consider, as we move forward and actually execute, not necessarily today, whether or not that value to this body and the community long-term of preserving, even though it's not technically 100% accurate, the understanding might be worth the cost of finance. So that's all. I don't quarrel at all with the planned use of it, and I know we can still kick that around some more when it comes to execution, but I want to get that thought into everybody's head a little bit.
So would you be saying that to use the TIF fund for the environmental things and the traffic signal would be appropriate, but you would rather try to finance the land purchase?
I think that the use of the TIF funds as contemplated on Ogden Avenue is all appropriate. I really do. I just think that the risk to us in long-term public impression of our actions and TIF usage is such that I might prefer to finance it. That's all.
Well, and I think added to that, ideally, if we could keep it and still get it done and still be net neutral, of course we would do that. So I think your point is we should continue to look at if there's bonding or other opportunities to cover those funds from a different source. We don't need it, and we could still achieve all this in basically net zero impact in terms of revenues. Sure.
There's legislation, I don't know its current status in Springfield too, that affects the opportunity of other parties to object to TIF institutions. And those all work against us because it's so tough to communicate. And so I just would like to do our best to preserve that, that's all.
Fair point. I just wanted to call on you.
Oh. Well, I didn't really have much to add right now.
That's okay.
But thank you.
You have that right. Anything else for now? Obviously, this is a conversation we've been having for some time. We'll continue to have it, and there are a lot of concrete steps that are coming up. We're simply starting to reflect things in the budget. So, A, because we have to, and then B, it starts to put things into the sharper focus as we move forward with this conversation. So if nothing else now, questions from the audience either on facilities or any of the other items in the list that Mr. Baker went through earlier and is also now putting up on the screen. Please.
Hello again, I'm Gordon Goodman, and I wanted to ask about an issue that came up in connection with the real estate fund One of the other concerns of the community at present is the Edwards House on Maple Avenue and the possibility of it's being redeveloped along with its neighboring parcel to produce a condominium of substantial height, and or maybe it's a rental property of substantial height, and some 60 odd other families living along that end of Maple Avenue. And we've had at least two major public discussions of that in Lincoln Center over the last couple of weeks. One of the questions that came up and suggestions that was made at that meeting was, well, if this is really important to the community, maybe the preservation of this house is a public responsibility. Why isn't the village talking about the possibility of buying this property and keeping it as a historic structure within the village? And one of the main reasons is the village doesn't have that sort of policy. But at this time, I'd like to bring that to the table and ask you to think about the possibility of using the real estate fund either in part or in whole to preserve historic properties in the village that otherwise would be developed in a way that we think from planning perspective is inappropriate. People have made the point that introducing another 60 odd families on this street that already has in this stretch between Maple and the tracks, roughly 70 families at present, would substantially impact the neighborhood, quite apart from any historic value. It would impact the schools, it would impact the traffic, and it recalls, to my mind, what went on over on Warren Avenue, where we now have Lloyd Park. At that time, the community decided that having multifamily development at that corner of, I don't know what the north-south street is, but on Warren Avenue, just east of Belmont Road, was entirely inappropriate. But the developer said, well, it's my property and this is what I want to do with it. And the village had finally the resort of saying, well, we'll buy the property from you and then we'll decide what we do with it. And now we have Lloyd Park instead of intensive multifamily housing there. So it's something that we've done in the past for other purposes, but in this case, I think the village surely should want to look at that possibility. The last point I want to make on this topic is the Historic Preservation Ordinance is something that the village adopted several years ago, and we do have two landmark private properties, but we don't have any historic districts, and there is an effort now afoot to get over half of the property owners along a portion of Maple Avenue in this neighborhood to ask the village to construct or to adopt a historic district to protect their property values. Well, we've looked again at the ordinance, and the ordinance says that all of these responsibilities for deciding about things like this and other powers after a historic district is set up devolve on the director of community planning. But as I look at the organizational table at the present time, there is no director of community planning for Downers Grove unless you've adopted some administrative procedure that assigns that duty to someone with a different job title. So I wanted to ask you to look into that possibility of making sure that the lines of authority are clear and somebody in the village has those responsibilities that were by ordinance assigned to the man with the, or woman with the job title Director of Community Development.
for purposes of that ordinance, that is me. I've assigned myself to that position. There's also other requirements statutorily of Director of Community Development. Some of them have been assigned to Stan, some of them have been assigned to Alex, but we are going through to document all those to make sure. But rest assured that in this case, that'll be the village manager.
Thank you for that information. And I hope you'll be willing to think about the things I've brought to the table.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Any further final comments on this subject from members of the council? And that wraps up the presentation for today?
Yes, sir.
So I'll ask for any closing thoughts or
Just
comments.
a general comment. Again, we talked about some pretty serious policy issues today. The actual paper clips and pencils conversation has been far removed from this council and this village's budget conversation, which is a really, really good thing. I'm hoping that we can find a wall big enough to put the award for this budget as well, but I think it goes to a lot of things that we...
Design in the next.
We did have a lot of community support. We had a lot of community question. We had a lot of community involvement today, and I think that goes to our process. It goes to how we communicate with our residents. It also goes to how we advertise our meetings, and it's a good thing that we had people here to hear, listen, and understand some of these very, very important next steps for our community. And I appreciate the conversation by not only the commissioners, but staff and our residents. So thank you, everybody, for taking time on a Saturday morning.
Well said. So I won't say it again. Anything else? All right, well, thank you for everyone for coming and for giving up a good part of your Saturday. Appreciate it very much. The conversation will continue. There will be further meetings of the council. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.